How about,
That looks great.
how's that looking? Is that better? Okay, because I know we found out through the 4-class series that it just recorded the notes and not the actual slides. So make sure it's on the right screen, right display, I should say. So again, thank you everyone for joining us this bright and early Saturday morning. We appreciate you spending your time with us. I see most of you have attended, so welcome back. As Nikki mentioned, I am kind of in charge of the Water Smart Landscape Makeover Program as a consultant for the San Diego County Water Authority. And I'm a landscape architect by day, and I teach landscape architecture through Southwestern College in the evening. So this is kind of a nice fit for my skills and trying to get some of these design strategies and the basic kind of plant and horticultural knowledge to make a landscape successful to you. So today we're going to be talking about our installation and maintenance process, which is kind of the final steps in transforming your yard. And this is really geared towards making your investment successful for the long term, you know, and also trying to reduce maintenance so that we can be out enjoying our beautiful region and not just be trimming shrubs and putting pesticides and things. If we choose carefully, we can limit our time with those efforts. So quick word on San Diego County Water Authority, and that is who sponsors the Water Smart Landscape Makeover Program. They're the wholesale water agency to our region. They have 24 member agencies, of which Nikki and her team at City of Oceanside are one of. They serve 3.3 million people, a 920,000 acre service area, and 97% of our county's population. And the Water Authority is responsible for building, owning, operating, and maintaining our regional water infrastructure. So I grew up in LA, and you know, growing up, we turned on the faucet and water came out, and there was not really the understanding of how far away we import a lot of our water resources from. So this is a really, I think, nice graphic to really show that 64% of our water comes from the Colorado River, and with it, it has some inherent challenges to growing plants well, because the Colorado River is in a very even more arid climate than we are. It tends to be a little bit higher in pH and salinity. So we have to kind of offset some of those to get some of our plants growing well. We get 20% from the State Water Project that runs through Central California, and we are now up to 16% local supply. So that's good news. I think 15, 20 years ago, it was about 4%. So we're making a lot of strides there. So in 1990, since 1990, when we had a major drought, which really triggered a lot of our water conservation in the state, we've had a 38% growth of the population, 44% growth in jobs, and 93% growth in our gross domestic product, yet our water use has gone down. Potable water use has been reduced by 29%, 47% reduction per person in our region. So good job, everyone, saving water. A lot of that was due to indoor water conservation, of going to the low flow faucets and toilets and all of that. So we're really focused on the exterior improvements to save water. So you don't have to have this, what we call a xeriscape. And if you love rocking cactus, there's nothing wrong with it. You see that strategy used a lot in Arizona, where they have extremely high and low temperatures. But we in Southern California generally are used to a little bit more color in our landscape. So on the right, you see a version of a low water landscape that we call California friendly. So it gives us the color and the green that we want, but it still is a relatively low water use landscape. So here's our case study house. You can see that there is a little bit of turf in front of this, and probably not many children out using that turf to throw a ball on, probably just the gardener who shows up every week to mow and blow it, and probably the neighborhood dogs using that lawn. So that would be an ideal area where we would target turf. It's not getting multiple uses to justify its high water use. So a great spot to retrofit. And the nice thing about it is in retrofitting it, you also reduce that maintenance time. So after installation, here's what it would look, that same area would look like. When I do these live, I ask people how they think this looks, and everybody kind of giggles and they say sparse. And if you're thinking that, that would be right. And one of the reasons is we also want to design for low maintenance. So these plants are planned so that they fill out at maturity, which keeps us from having to go ahead and over prune everything all the time if we're overplanting. So this is that same site about 6 months after installation. You can see this ground cover. Those were like little plugs from flats is starting to really fill out. This is called silver carpet. It is a really nice turf replacement ground cover, kind of gives you that same effect. And it can take some traffic, takes a while to fill in, but after about a year, it'll be nice and filled in. But nice turf replacement. But you can really see those medium shrubs are really starting to fill into their mature size now and creating some interest in that space along with the boulders and the pottery. And then after about 2 years, which is what we consider establishment, you start seeing the shrubs along the back, softening that back wall. You can really see that silver carpet has filled in nicely along the front and creating, you know, just a low ground cover that's very low maintenance, no mowing, reduced water, kind of keeping a very open entry along the walkways. But now you can kind of see this blend of colors and textures creating an interesting display. I would call that a view garden going into that house and being low maintenance too. Low water, low maintenance. So you can go out and play at the beach. So just some other views of that case study house. So our Water Smart Landscape Makeover program started with this Water Smart Landscape Makeover Guide. And I will show you at the end of the presentation where you can find this, download a PDF on the website. This is really the 7 steps to a Water Smart landscape. So I recommend if you're new to this kind of steps to reference that particular guide. And then we had a lot of people request more help with the steps. So we created the 4-class landscape makeover series. Good news is we are back up and running with a virtual option and still getting to work one-on-one with a design coach, either in person or virtual for that session. But then like this webinar, the lectures are all virtual now. I will show you where to find the registration link. We advertised for the classes a few weeks ago and had an overwhelming response. So we have filled all the classes for the fall. We will be running more classes after the winter break, kind of in late winter, early spring next year. But it might be something if you want to register for that. There's some eligibility requirements. Again, we'll talk about that at the end. And then we've got videos on demand. So for those of you who have not taken one of these workshops and you're like, we're going to rush through the steps to get to the last step of installation and maintenance today, know that there's some great videos online that are 5-7 minutes long that will kind of walk through the steps and give you a lot of demonstrations. So those of you who haven't checked out these videos and maybe have done the other workshops, there's still some really wonderful demos and interviews with people in that in those videos that are available 24/7. And then you guys are in this installation and maintenance, but about a year ago we launched special topics. So there's a range of topics to choose from. So, you know, keep an eye out. The Water Authority is running all the topics regularly at this point online. And here is the new website. So for those of you who have taken one of these classes before, know that the website has changed. It's in the process of changing. It's kind of in its transition period, but pretty soon the old website won't be publicly available. So we ask you to go to this page. It's watersmartsd.org, and then you can get into the Landscape Makeover Program site. Again, we'll jump on this at the end of the session, and you'll be able to I'll walk you through where some of these resources are found. So today's a 3-hour tour and understanding of the implementation process, how to properly schedule your irrigation, and that's kind of key to one of the key factors in long-term plant success. And then how to maintain non-turf areas, because it's a little bit different than mowing lawn every couple weeks. So here's the steps for a water smart landscape. I guess it's 6 steps. I don't know why I was thinking 7. We talked about 7 at one point. So our goal is to help you develop the knowledge and skills necessary to create your own beautiful water smart landscape. And that's what we found is the limitation to homeowners implementing a new landscape, is that there is quite a bit of technical information that we need to get to you so that you're investing your money wisely. And that's why we created these programs. So people usually attend this to understand how to remove their turf, improve their soil, select healthy plants, get irrigation retrofit tips, get help creating an irrigation schedule, and understand landscape maintenance for non-turf areas. So quickly, we target turf because turf is our most thirsty plant category in general. There's a few tropicals that are even higher than turf, but in general, turf is our #1 water user. And this idea is that if you live in the coastal strand, you're going to use less water to maintain a healthy turf than as you move inland. So coastal strand might use 33 inches of water a year. As you move into, Poway area, you're going to use 55 inches of water a year to maintain that same turf in a healthy manner. We receive about 10 inches of water a year. Our average turf is about 47 inches in the region. So there's a lot of water we need to import to maintain turf. And if you were going to go to a climate that gets 40 inches of rainfall, you would be at a place somewhere like Portland, Oregon. And so you can see their turf does not have any irrigation heads in it because they get enough rain that they can usually grow that without supplemental water. And what they end up paying for is for people to come and scrape the moss off the walls because it is so damp up there. So we live in a Mediterranean climate, and that means we get our rain over a relatively short period of time, and we then have long dry periods. And there are a number of regions around the world that also have the same kind of rain cycle. And so we look to plants for those regions for water conserving strategies. So from a regional perspective, targeting our turf is easy water savings. We can easily retrofit your landscape for water efficiency. We got to get you some skills and technical knowledge, and that's our goal, is helping you succeed. So first step is you want to identify your landscape target, and that's really a factor, that's really identifying how much water you want to save and, what level of reduced water is compatible with your lifestyle. You may have a dog or kids who need a patch of turf, and we are not anti-turf by any means, but we're saying if you're going to keep turf, can you reduce the footprint of that turf and have it meet your needs? So what we really want to avoid is turf that is not serving multiple uses. So when we look to go to a water efficient landscape, we're looking at the plant's water use as one factor and our irrigation efficiency. So for kind of the 3-star landscape, we would have highly efficient irrigation and very low plant water use. So quick overview on irrigation. Most people have inherited our traditional overhead spray shrubs, and these are low efficiency, or we say high precipitation or high rain. A lot of water coming out of these quickly, usually too fast for the soil to absorb it, so it starts moving laterally into the storm drain system before the plants can even access that water. Newer technology is our low precipitation irrigation heads. This is what we consider medium efficiency. And then high efficiency would be drip irrigation and bubblers. So just a quick overview of plant selection by water use. Our very low would be a lot of our California native species and adapted, succulents. Some of those very dry climate succulents would be in that category. We have low water use. These hold their green color a little bit longer. There are certainly succulents included in there, and there are natives, but they tend to be from those other Mediterranean climates. Our standard horticultural plants are medium water use. Kind of our medium high would be our turf, and kind of our thirsty tropical species. We really aren't seeing these used very often anymore because they are so high in water use. So one of the initial steps on steps 2 is to create a basic plot plan. You're going to do that by measuring your property and then record those measurements to create a base plan. And that is really easily done with grid paper. So grid paper comes in different scales. For a small residential house, you could use a 1/4-inch grid, but there's also 1/8-inch grid. And if you have a larger property, there's 10th-inch grid and 1/20 grids. And the way you would just transfer the measurements of every grid being 1 foot, and you will have drawn your property at a 1/4-inch scale. So we want to look at our soil texture. That is actually the weathered rock component of soil. So that's an important part of our soil to, provide some of the micronutrients for our plants. It's also the greater portion of what your backfill or the soil around your plants should be. I've seen some people go to the big box stores and buy just the compost and try and plant their plants in the compost and wonder why the plants died. You need about 70% mineral to make the plants be successful. And then we categorize that mineral component or the weathered rock component by its size. So sand is our biggest soil particle. This is our inorganic soil particle, and it's very fast draining. It doesn't hold water well. It doesn't hold nutrients well. If you have a medium-sized particle, we call that a silt-sized particle. And this is kind of a nice balance. It allows water to drain, but it also holds some water close to the roots and some nutrients close to the roots. And at the other end of the spectrum is clay, which are very, very small particles. Can't see them with the naked eye. They actually form these little plates, and you'll see the plates together, not the particles. Very slow draining, very good at holding water once it's wet. It will stay wet for days and weeks after a rain. And usually if you have clay in your yard because it will just suck the shoes right off of you if you walk through it. It does hold nutrients and water well. It also doesn't release it well to the plant. It chemically binds these up so tight the plants can't access it. Most of the soil in our region is loam, which means it's a mixture of all particle types. And this is actually a really, good soil to grow things in. We tend to lack the inorganic component to support healthy plant growth. But a loam soil functions a lot like a silt soil, where it has good water drainage. It can hold water and nutrient close to where the plants can access it. So to determine your soil texture, you can dig a hole. You're going to remove any mulch or surface matter before you do that. I like to dig a 12 by 12 by 12 inch hole because I'm going to reuse that hole for a percolation test. And you're going to take a sample from the side of the hole at least 6 inches down. So think of like slicing a slice off a layer cake. You want that whole profile. And that's what you would use for your texture test. And then you're going to put it in a mason jar is the easiest way. So I have here a mason jar with about half soil and about half water. And I'm going to shake it up really well. And you can see on the graphic, it has these nice bands of where the sand looks all beige like sand, and the silt looks kind of brown like dirt, and then the clay looks red like a terracotta pot. That is not usually how it looks in a real world. You can see this is all like chocolate milk. So when the weathered rock particles break up, they just make bigger and smaller particles, but they're all the same color. So I've got my jar all mixed up, and the first thing I do is I'm going to tip it over, and the first 3 to 5 seconds, my sand is heavy, it's going to fall out really fast. So I mark it after about 3 to 5 seconds. And then I'll have my percentage of sand. Then I'm going to let the water sit for about 2 to 3 minutes, and I'll mark it again, and that will be my silt, because those are the medium-sized particles. So they're going to settle out pretty quickly. I don't think you can see it. You can just start to see there's my sand. You can't see it on there, but mostly sand in this one, and then a little bit of silt settling out. And then the clay particles, depending on how small they are, could take anywhere from a few hours to a week to settle out. So you're just going to set that somewhere and let everything settle down where the water becomes clear again. And you can go online and Google the soil texture pyramid. It's readily available. It's the USDA soil texture pyramid. And it will take kind of this mid-range one. To say we have 40% sand, I would go right to the 40 here. And maybe we've got 30%, let's say 20% clay. So here's my 20 and 30, and then 40% silt. We would end up right in that middle category of loam. So that's the way you would use this. It's just kind of following the lines on up to where they all converge. And then you would have a good idea what your soil texture is. So our soil texture influences the way our site handles water. So especially in regard to infiltration. So soil texture, also our aggregation and our layers of compaction and rock. So the reason that I recommend the 12 by 12 by 12 inch hole is soil texture is one factor of how our soil handles water, but percolation is another. You can have areas in our region that have layers of seabed formations underneath, and so water doesn't infiltrate really well. So we're going to use that same hole, 12 by 12 by 12 inch, fill it up with water, kind of saturate around the area and let it drain down. That could be overnight if you have slower draining soil, or it might just be 5 minutes if you live by the beach. Then you're going to lay a stick over the hole, refill the hole to the water level of the stick, wait an hour and measure how far the water's dropped. And if you're around, I like to do this over a few hours period and average the amount of dropping. And so I get a better feel for my infiltration rate. And we say less than 1 inch is slow draining. And so there's some plants like those very arid climate succulents that are not tolerant of slow draining soil. So if we wanted those, we would create some mounds. We also can correct this by adding organics to the soil, which kind of forms aggregation in the soil. 1 to 3 inches is kind of our sweet spot. It's draining fast enough to keep water, the roots having access to air and not just be saturated, but then it's also keeping some water available to the plant up in that upper profile. And then more than 3 inches an hour is fast draining soil. So again, if we wanted very maybe lush tropical plants, it might be draining too fast for those. So we might have to create mounds with a richer soil with more organic material in it to keep water up close to the plant's profile. But that fast draining is perfect for those very arid climate succulents. And we can also add organics to fast draining soil to slow down the water. And again, that is creating aggregation in the soil. And in a fast draining soil, it kind of creates a glaze of water that the plants can continue to use. So that's kind of home-based kind of soil testing to understand your texture and how water might move through your soil profile. But you can also do a professional horticultural soil testing to understand the pH and the micronutrients. So in this case, soil can be sent to a lab for testing and recommendations to support new plant growth or existing plant growth. We recommend soil testing being done by an independent lab, not as a free vendor service. So some of the supply houses, especially for landscape professionals, will do free soil testing. The problem with those is it's kind of done quickly in their back room, not really by a soil scientist. And they also will make recommendations of very expensive amendments. That's how they pay for that service. So you're better off spending the money on an independent lab who will give you recommendations that are like very low cost, basic compost and mineral amendments than getting a soil test with lots of pricey amendments that sometimes are chemical based too, that aren't organic products. So you can take soil and do send in a test of what we call an aggregate sample, which means you're going to fill a quart-sized bag from small shovelfuls digging down and taking little 6-inch samples from multiple points in the yard and mixing it together. Or if you think you have very different soil types in different parts of the yard, you can do separate samples. Each soil test and report to recommend amendments cost between $150 to $250 per sample. And I would say most likely on this upper end. So that aggregate sample is a nice way to just get a generalized report for your site, unless you have a problem somewhere. So we talked about how to properly dig a hole. You're going to dig that hole at least 6 inches down and take a side slice of it. If you happen to have a soil probe, that's ideal. Soil probes are difficult to use in our region because we have so much compaction. It's mostly mineral. It's hard to get that probe in there. But that is actually the most proper way to take soil samples, and you would just probe from different areas. Either way, you're going to want to fill a quart-sized freezer bag, which is about 3 to 4 cups of soil. That's how much a lab will need. Here's what a submittal form would look like. So common horticultural testing includes, you can have your soil tested, you could have your water tested if you think there's a water problem. You could have, maybe if you're on a well or some other gray water kind of source, you could send in a water sample. Or you can even test your compost. So if you're making compost in your yard and you want to make sure it's a balanced compost, you could send that in for testing. These are the 2 laboratories in Southern California. Neither one of them is in San Diego. So as a professional, I have to ship my soil sample to them. Of the 2, they're both excellent laboratories. Waypoint Analytical, I find their reports are a little bit easier to interpret and read. Wallace Laboratory really has an understanding if there's a problem soil. Maybe you feel like you have legacy chemicals and contaminants in the soil. They can really develop some strategies. A lot of times back in the 50s and 60s, they would put down legacy pesticides around the perimeter of the house to keep termites away, like DDT and things that we aren't allowed to use anymore. And those can persist in the soil and sometimes prevent plants from growing. So we have seen that condition. And if you suspect something like that, or something hazardous has been spilled, Wallace really they both have a good understanding of this, but I would say Wallace specializes in those difficult conditions. Both would require you to ship the sample to them and prepay via credit card. Here's an example of a form you would download from, this one's from Waypoint Analytical. There is, for new planting, I usually recommend this complete, so it gives all the micronutrients. That's the one I select, and then you would tell them, it's site soil, and I would also tell them what I'm planting. So I'm not planting turf. Maybe I'm doing a tree and a shrub backfill, or maybe I'm doing ground cover, or I have some specialty plants. Maybe I'm a plumeria enthusiast and I want a plumeria view garden. I might give them that, and then they'll customize that report for you. normal time is once they receive your payment and the sample, it's generally 5 to 7 working days, and then they email you a report. So pretty good system. Here's an example of what a report looks like. This is from a real job in our region. You can see that we don't have anything in red, so none of these nutrients are on the high side. They are either sufficient or low, but some things you might come across that can affect your plant is pH. So this particular project site is 6.9 pH. What we call a balanced pH is 7.0, so it's right where it should be, and that's good news. A lot of times we have an alkaline pH or a high pH, so it might be 7.9, 8%, and that means an alkaline condition. A lot of times our water supply is alkaline, so if we're watering with potable water and we haven't had a good rainfall, the alkalinity can start increasing, and that would impair the growth of certain types of plants. It's going to go through all your micronutrients. It's also going to give you your soil texture type. So you can see they've looked at, if there's any gravel. Gravel's our biggest chunks of weathered rock that's above the size of sand, but they're going to grade the different sizes of sand, and then the percentage of silt and the percentage of clay. You can see this was a very sandy soil, so they classified it as sand. And then some of the salinity can come into play. So if you have a high salinity, maybe you're coastal, the report would give you recommendations on how to amend for that condition. And this is the thing to know about soil. So 7.0 is considered our balanced pH. And what happens is if, like, say we tend to have alkaline soil, so you can see after about 8.0, couple of the micronutrients we see depleted a lot in our region are iron and manganese. And you can see that they get bound up. Once our alkalinity increases, these become less available to plants. So, we see signs of iron starvation with the yellow leaves with a real green veination. This is really common in our region. I see citrus plants need a lot of iron. They utilize a lot of iron. So you see that kind of starvation. The reverse is true. If you also were in a very acidic soil, you would start, like magnesium would be one that's less available, and phosphorus gets bound up when we have low. So kind of a nice chart to see as our alkalinity increases, these are the ones that can cause a problem of not being available to plants. Typical soil amendments for our region include gypsum. So this helps with the alkalinity. It helps release that salt buildup and starts lowering the pH. So gypsum is great. You can buy it at Home Depot. I would say be very careful with gypsum applications because it is actually a salt itself. So if you put too much down, it has the opposite effect and it will increase the salinity. So when you apply gypsum, it should be like a powdered sugar on top of the soil, and then you mix it in, and then water, as you irrigate, it starts to reduce the alkalinity. If you had the opposite, where you had acidic soil and you needed to increase the pH to make it more alkaline, we would add sulfur. This is not a common amendment in our region, but we do have pockets of highly acidic soil. Those generally relate to some of our coastal strand areas. So a soil report will tell you if you need to, amend with either one of these. NPK, so if you buy a soil fertilizer from the store, you might see, 5, 10, 15, or 5 and 15, 15. That's your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are what plants use the most. So these are amendments that we sometimes add back in when we're doing new planting to try and increase the fertility of the soil. And then compost kind of helps with the nutrients and the micronutrients. So it starts to break down and naturally feed the soil without the use of like chemical fertilizers. So that's a very common soil amendment in our region because our plants are adapted to hold on to their leaves and not lose them. You know, it's too water costly to lose your leaves. So it's not like the Midwest where it turns cold and all the trees lose their leaves and that gets worked into the soil as organic matter as it breaks down. Here, our plants hold on to their leaves. They don't want to have to regenerate those again. So we don't have a lot of organic matter in our soil. And so that's a really common amendment that we need to add in our region. So compost is that organic matter. It provides our micronutrients and supports our soil food web. And it's usually finely screened. It's meant to be incorporated into the planting soil. So here is an example of a compost. You can see it. This is a locally made compost. For those of you up in Oceanside, you have the El Corazon Green Waste Facility, and AgriService runs that there, and they have donated these samples. But this is all locally produced from our local landscape trimmings, and City of Oceanside residents get kind of free composted amendments, which is fabulous. So really nice, high quality, and you can see it's just the plant parts have been broken down to create this rich organic matter layer that we would then fold into our backfill of our plants to increase fertility. So should be 30 to 60 days mature to ensure weeds and pathogens are killed. You can get it in bulk, like at the landfills or your nurseries, the bigger nurseries, or you can buy it in bags at most big box stores. Try and avoid compost made with biosolids if you're planning to use it on edible plants. So biosolids is composted human waste, which is fine for plants. We need a use for it, but probably not plants you want to eat. So eco scraps is one that is suitable for vegetable and flower gardens. It usually will say that, or you can look for this OMRI certified. This is a very expensive listing for compost companies to get. And that's why a lot of our local producers, they produce to this criteria, but they don't have the certification. If they did, they wouldn't be able to sell their product because it would cost so much. But if you're buying from a big box store, you're going to look for an OMRI certified compost, which will let you know that it's made from, it's not made with human waste. And so good measure of quality for prepackaged compost. And then kind of going back to our overview steps, step 4 is really thinking about how to shape your spaces. So is your new space an outdoor room, a passageway, or a garden? And usually for converting turf, we're really kind of creating one of these kind of 3 simple concepts or a combination of a couple of them. So really nice turf retrofit with this past participant to our 4-class series. She had this long strip of turf, high water use, and she had a special needs child. So I love that she created this kind of path that she could take her child in her wheelchair through right in her front yard, and then there's all these sensory plants. This is brand new planting, so those haven't filled out yet. But she really took back that yard and made it lower water use and made it work for her. So as we look at implementation, kind of the normal steps that are involved in converting turf to a water smart landscape is we would demolish the existing turf or landscape. We might reshape the earth or contour the earth. We could have those mounds for planting that we talked about, or even swales or little valleys where we might want to infiltrate water if our soil is so compatible. We're going to amend the soil, adjust and add irrigation as needed, plant our plants, install our plants, and then after we're going to maintain them forever, But after the first 2 years, that's what we consider the establishment period. We actually consider from the first 2 rainy seasons after planting that's our establishment period. I think this is a good time to stop for our first break. I might have rolled right through that, Nikki.
No problem. We don't have any questions in the chat yet. So folks, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you to ask a question.
Nope. Well, good job, you guys. That was threw a lot of plant science stuff at you, so good job. Okay. So if we're going to start at implementation, and we have turf, we want to focus on the options of removing the turf or sheet mulching it, or like kind of composting in place to the turf. So we're going to prepare the site. That might include, you know, we'll break down the strategy. I guess this is an overview of implementation, not of just the turf removal part. That'll be the next part. So we're going to prepare the site. We're going to deal with some of the the edges of the existing turf and any mounding and contouring. Ensure we're maintaining water to existing trees and plants, and then adjusting the irrigation for the new planted areas. You're going to select and place and plant the large plants. Under inorganic rock, we might apply a weed barrier. We don't recommend that in areas with just organic mulch, because we want that mulch and compost to break down and feed the soil and get that soil biology started. And then we're going to layer our compost and mulch over the top. So quick word on our trees. If you have mature trees, the root zones of those can be shallow and extensive. And if you've ever seen one blown down in a storm, it's really kind of shocking how shallow the root zones can be. So the most critical distance to protect the roots is 10 times the trunk diameter, measured at about 4 feet high, or we say DBH, diameter at breast height. And so we want to make sure we say, if it's like a 1 foot diameter, then it would be 10 feet away from that tree. If it's a big tree, whatever it is, 3 feet diameter, then it would be 30 feet away from that tree. Sometimes the conventional thinking is the drip line, which is great. If you can save the tree roots to the drip line, you're doing well. Sometimes we have to come in a little bit closer to the tree to adjust the grade. So you can, arborists tell me that 10 times the trunk diameter is the absolute critical root zone. So be very careful when removing sod or doing any kind of work in that area. We want to protect the tree, keep it. So most tree roots have their roots in the upper 6 inches of soil. So a lot of people have this idea of like, oh, I want a deep rooted or a tap root, or they hear different things. But if a tree sends down a tap root, that's usually a very early root that anchors the tree. And then these feeder roots spread out over the surface. And in existing turf areas, those are very shallow because the watering regime has been, daily watering for just a little bit of time to keep the sod wet. So it develops a very shallow root system. So we're actually going to be changing the watering regime, and so we don't want to impact that tree by too much by changing the water regime and then starting to really mess with the grade around the tree. So we never want to mound soil around the trunk or that critical root zone. We want to minimize adding new planting in the critical root zone, and better to mulch around that instead. If you feel like you need to add new plants in there, you would get as small containers as possible and kind of work them carefully into the root zone. And we want to try to include a separate irrigation zone or a separate distribution point to our irrigation system for existing trees. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So irrigating existing trees, this is only going to cause problems with this tree by creating an environment where this very critical root zone of where the trunk of the tree meets the soil. If we have irrigation, in this case is a drip irrigation line right up against that trunk, it could create kind of diseases and fungus right in that critical zone. So we want to keep water away from that zone. That's not where trees take up their water. They have that netted layer of roots that runs out to the drip line and beyond. So you can see this is a retrofit to a drip irrigation. They've got the first ring away from the tree trunk, and then they're coming out to really cover the drip zone to that. So we want to ensure that area is irrigated at a minimum, that critical root zone. Before you start your project, you might want to call 811, which is a great free service in our region. And that locates the utilities at the street. They will come out and they will mark kind of in the public right-of-way where the service lines would go into your house, so where your gas line goes in and where your water goes in. And that's important to know, because if you or your contractor starts digging in the front and you hit a gas line and the fire department's called and SDG&E is called and they have to shut it down and evacuate the neighborhood, it's on you. If you've called 811 and they've marked the line and you dig in another place and it wasn't marked according to the as-built plans or wasn't built according to the plans they have, and you hit the gas line, then it's not on you. You know, it just wasn't in the right place. So always a good measure of safety if you're going to be digging in the front yard where there's a lot of the utility lines, to know where those are. So if you kind of lay out the areas that are going to become paths and patios, you don't have to worry about sheet mulching and amending those areas. Those aren't going to, we don't need the soil biology to get restarted in those areas. And then also, as you're laying out the hardscape areas, think about maybe you want an irrigation sleeve below the hardscape. So we just put a piece of PVC pipe down below maybe a new walkway, so we can always connect one side of the hardscape to the other if we need it in the future or for our plan. So we always like to recommend, before you start removing turf or sheet mulching turf, to mark the irrigation heads. So you can do this by turning on the zone and seeing, you know, where the heads pop up. And you can get these little pin flags from Home Depot or irrigation supply houses and just mark where the heads are. And then if you call out a contractor to come out and use a sod cutter and they start ripping up the turf, you've got the flags marked, and you can tell them, do not damage my existing irrigation equipment because I intend to reuse it. And so they're going to have to work around those. If you don't tell them that, they're going to take their sod cutter up and tear up all your heads, and then you won't be able to reuse that system. So use pin flags to mark the head locations, and that also enables you to find the irrigation once mulch has been installed. So here's an example of, you know, in this particular participant, they wanted to redo the front area to the door, and they also had a very typical condition where, you know, they maybe were parking cars in the driveway, but then you had to step out onto the turf, you know, because the driveway wasn't wide enough. So they wanted to widen that edge. And that is a point to consider if you're removing turf in the front. If you're going to put new plants of succulents and ground covers and roses or whatever, you can't really step onto that very easily. So sometimes we need to add a strip to widen that a little bit if you regularly have people parking in the front driveway. You can see the meter is right here. So meter typically runs straight into the house. It's usually a straight line, and sometimes there's at an angle, but generally you probably would go right to this edge of the house or the side of the house and see the service line coming up and into the house. So that gives you an idea of where not to plant trees. We don't want to plant trees on top of our water lines, or we're going to have problems down the road. And you can see they didn't need to amend this part where they widened the paving here, because they really kind of bring the soil level down, and they bring the contractors will bring in what's called a class 2 base or something similar, and that's a very stable surface they compact to support, in this case, interlocking pavings, but you would do the same thing for like concrete or anything else. So you don't need to amend the soil there. They're going to dig it out and give you a good, they should be digging it down at least 4 to 6 inches and giving you a solid base to build hardscape on. So here's what a sod cutter looks like. So there's a couple choices on how we remove turf. So it is a strategy that, you know, removes turf quickly. Warm season turf is difficult to kill just in general. So it might be more effective to remove turf with a sod cutter if you've got warm season turf. It's certainly faster. It does create some landfill. It's got to be carried off to the landfill. So a little bit more labor intensive and disposal intensive. The other option is to kind of compost turf in place. So that can help to improve our soil, reduces sending things off to the landfill. It's less labor, and I would say it costs less because of the labor. A lot of people get that bill for the mulch and they say, how can that cost less? But at the end, we're recommending mulching anyway. So either way, you're going to be hopefully mulching your site to keep weeds down and keep feeding the soil. So the mulch cost is like you pay it up front or you pay it at the end when the planting's done. And then how to identify what type of turf you have is important. So cool season is what we generally start with. We all get some, you know, beautiful not blue fescue, just the regular dwarf fescue that comes in the big sod sheets. If we get a new house or we pay a landscape contractor to come in and put new turf down, delivered on a pallet, and it's all rolled up, and they roll it all out, and that's what we call our cool season turf generally. And so year round, if you had cool season turf, it would be green in winter and summer. It grows in small tufts. It has seeds that look like these little flowers, these little florets. And again, we all usually start with this. And the good thing is if you still have it, this is very easy to kill. So we can easily do this with sheet mulching. What generally happens is we start with this and we hire the same landscape maintenance guy who's maintaining everybody's on the block, who only has one mower, and who is now distributing Bermuda, which is our most common warm season turf, seeds in your nice blue fescue grass, combined with neighbors' dogs urinating on it, which tends to create burn patches in cool season turf. To me, that's an indicator of cool season if you have those little brown spots in it. So you get these bare patches and it doesn't self-heal. You've got to keep reseeding those bare patches, or these warm season seeds will also blow in from neighbors' grasses too. And eventually it feels like we all end up with Bermuda. So Bermuda grass, or our warm season grass, is going to be winter dormant. So it will turn kind of a golden hay color starting in fall, and turn nice and green in the summer. A lot of times you see like the athletic fields, they overseed with a seasonal rye when they have a winter to keep it looking green. I've had participants tell me that their HOAs just, write them all kinds of letters to, they're in trouble because their grass is dying and they keep turning their water up and up and up. But if you have a warm season grass, it doesn't matter how much you water it, it's dormant. It's not going to turn green. So maybe a little bit of HOA management education, if that's what you have, to help them understand that that's the normal cycle of a warm season turf. And this is a little bit less thirsty. Doesn't use quite as much water as a cool season turf. So some of our newer lawn varieties, like hybrid Bermudas, which are a little more well-behaved than the common Bermuda, or even if you're coastal Paspalum, are lower water use. plants, but they do turn gold in the summer, and they need a little different mowing regime. These plants have a kind of creeping stolon, so you see these long runners. So it is self-healing. They're more tolerant to dogs' urine on them. They don't create the burn patches, and they do self-heal. So they'll spread out and fill in a missing patch. Their flowers look like these little bird feet when they're in flower. And the common one that most of us have is Bermuda. St. Augustine used it a lot of the playing fields for high school. It's a really coarse grass. Kikuyu is a really coarse grass that is invasive in our region. So sometimes it gets blown in and starts really wreaking havoc on your front yard. It's a big, heavy grass in there. So kill methods: solarization, chemical, followed by sheet mulching. Really difficult to kill warm season grass, and really important to kill warm season grass because it does tend to come back readily, and you don't want it to come back in your new planting. So warm season turf issues, very resilient, may break through new planting, so watch for regrowth and remove it. It requires pre-treatment, sometimes multiple treatments. So different ways to remove pre-treat warm season turf. We talked about sod cutting as being kind of a fast method. You'd still want to make sure that it's not, the roots aren't in there and it's not going to come back. So you might do a sod cutter, start watering it, see if you see any growth, and then put a little bit of herbicide to kill any new regrowth that starts. You can solarize it. So you're going to want to use, this is a great time of year to solarize it when it's hot out. You're going to use a clear plastic and, you know, kind of put, this case you can see they're going to create a bigger planter area and they're going to keep part of their turf. So they're solarizing the area they want to remove, and you're using the sun to almost bake it in place. Know that when you do solarization, you also kill the biological community in the soil that we want. We want that, you know, soil food web to support new healthy plant growth. So really important to amend that soil after solarization, or you can use an herbicide and spray. So follow all of these with mulching to kind of keep the soil moist. So again, we talked about the sod cutter is sod removal and then goes to the landfill. It's not recyclable. Again, so solarization is clear plastic, not the black, done in warm season, won't work in winter, takes about 8 to 12 weeks, and it doesn't work in shade. And again, we talked about you need to add a compost to that area after you're done. We have a range of herbicides, so some are organic and some are inorganic. You're going to spray the herbicides when plants are actively growing. So if you have that warm season turf and you start, you know, waiting until fall, it goes dormant, these aren't going to work. You're just going to have to wait till spring to start it. You always follow the manufacturer's instructions. That's going to give you some safety precautions. And then with especially the warm season turf, repeat the application. So see it kind of die back, maybe start watering it again for a few days and see if any areas green up, and then go hit them again. Nikki, do we have any questions? So sometimes the turf removal, I get a lot of questions for that. If not, I'll keep going a little longer.
We do have one raised hand, so I wonder if you want to take that question now. I think it's from...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, Mona, you can unmute yourself now.
Hi, thank you very much.
Hi, Mona.
I have a question.
Oh, absolutely.
Back in the doing my own soil testing, and the question is, if I you had said to do a 12 by 12 by 12, and should I mix that up before I put that into the mason jar? And then how much of that should I put into the mason jar and how much water? I think I missed that part.
Yeah, so let me clarify that. So I like to start the soil testing and percolation testing by moving the mulch aside and then digging a 12 by 12 by 12 inch hole. And then from that hole, I might take the side sliver of the hole, and that's what I use to fill the mason jar or put in the quart-sized bag to send off to a soil lab. Then I use that hole to do the percolation test. So when you're taking a soil sample, you really want that whole profile of the soil, like a layer cake slice. And then whatever size jar you're using, just try and about 50% soil and then about 50% water. You can see I'm losing some of my water here. About a 50-50 mix. Some people say to add a drop of detergent in there. I don't see the need to do that. If you can see right at the top, this little floaty stuff right at the, it's kind of cloudy still from our testing, and the clay still being suspended. But that is really just the little bits of organic matter that have floated to the top. But I'm really focused on the mineral component of soil. And I don't think you can see the stripes because of the lighting coming in the window, but I can see right here, it's about sand. See here, this is a sandy loam sample. I know I have about 50% sand. And then my silt has settled down. It's probably about 20 to about, well, this might be 60% sand, and then about 30, 25% silt. And my clays are just starting to settle out, and I've got a little glaze of clay there. But I think the way the light's coming in the window, you can't see those stripes happening. But, that's the method, 50-50 water, and making sure you get that full soil profile. And the reason we do that is sometimes the upper levels are amended, or if you're looking at a turf area, there's just a lot more sloughing of the roots that create more organic matter up high, but as you get down low, it's starting to get into the mineral area. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Mona. And then we did have a request, Michelle, if you can show the grass killer slide again, so they can take note of the brands.
Yeah. Well, okay. So on brands, I'm gonna address Monsanto and Roundup. So I have not shown any Roundup on this particular slide because it always creates controversy, and that's not what we want in this class. But I will give you my 2 cents on it. So these are organic ones. I don't show any inorganic herbicides. Based on the feedback from our participants, most people are using an inorganic type of herbicide. I worked habitat restoration, not just design, but also implementation for many, many years. And part of those regimes, and these were around endangered species, is our go-to herbicide was Roundup. And there's 2 versions of it at the professional level. You have your basic Roundup, and then you have what we call a water-safe Roundup. So at the professional level, if we're around an aquatic system, we would use this water-safe version, and we would use a different type of surfactant, which is the piece that makes the herbicide stick to the leaves of plants. My colleagues who still maintain environments in around endangered species continue to use Roundup. That is their preferred herbicide. One of the reasons being is that some of the Roundup knockoffs, they found they've added additional chemicals in it to make the grass turn brown or plant turn brown quickly. So you apply it and you see it start wilting and turning brown like in hours. Roundup is actually a salt. It's called glyphosate, and salt is generally pretty toxic to plants. So that's their main active ingredient. And then they add these, what we call stickers or surfactants to make it stick to the leaves. They don't add any of these instant browning type chemicals in there. Those are really added for the homeowner to be like, oh, it's working, so I can see it. And so they don't start applying more. But they found that some of those additives are actually much more dangerous than the glyphosate salt base on it. So I trust my colleagues who do restoration on a big scale, and they are all scientists, and that's their, you know, kind of preferred. I'm not advocating for Monsanto or not Monsanto. I think the really important thing is, you know, herbicides, sometimes we need to use them. Herbicides generally are much safer than pesticides. When you have to kill another living being, you use a lot more serious chemicals than killing a plant. Plants are pretty easy to kill. So they're generally a low toxicity. The biggest problems that the industry sees is in people who are not trained as a pesticide applicator, going to Home Depot, buying a concentrated version, and then saying, well, if I make it regular strength, if I make it twice as strong, it'll work faster. And so always follow the directions, both for mixing a non-organic or any chemical for that matter. Make sure you're checking when it's safe to apply it, and make sure you're wearing your protective gear. But I think it can be used wisely. But there are inorganic choices. I tend to use inorganic choices, obviously, on my edible plants. And I do try and use inorganic choices first. I have found with Bermuda grass, it is just so difficult to kill, and you want to make sure it's dead, because you don't want that coming back and trying to then get it out of new planting. That's a real maintenance problem. So we want to make sure that Bermuda is gone before we put our new plants in. And that's my soapbox.
Great. She's also asking where they sell these products. So maybe if you can give that.
I went to Lowe's and bought I got the garden safe variety for my edibles. I just was like, okay, I'm all about inorganic right up to the point of where all those bugs are eating the things I've worked so hard to grow. So I gave in and I went to the Garden Safe brand, and I know Lowe's has some of that. I really like Walter Anderson's nursery. They've got an incredible help desk there. So both for some plant questions, or if you have a pest that you need to know what it is, they can help you identify it. And they have a really wide range of different organic and inorganic pesticides and herbicides. And then there's a lot of home, like on the internet, concoctions of like vinegar and lemon juice. And I don't know how effective those are. I haven't ever tried them. But in all, we'll talk about integrated pest management kind of within this topic as we get into maintenance. But, you know, always starting with, you know, trying to avoid chemicals as much as possible and other strategies, and then kind of increasing what type of chemicals you're using until you get to the inorganic chemicals is kind of, you know, the sustainable practices for landscape maintenance and dealing with pest outbreaks and fungus outbreaks and things like that. So I'd recommend your big box stores, see what they have, and then Walter Anderson's nursery. They have one in Point Loma and Poway.
Great. Thanks. I think that's all for now.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to remove our woody and invasive plants, remove our pre-treat warm season turf, which we've just talked about extensively, flag the sprinkler heads, soak the area with water. Some of the prepping of the site, this is where we're talking about edging just along the sidewalks. So we want to drop the grade down along here so we don't have all of our surface mulch when it rains flowing out onto the sidewalk. So we want to kind of lock that mulch in place. Manual grubbing is you or your landscapers out there with shovels tearing up the turf. We talked about sod cutters. Again, sod cutters around trees, not a good thing. They are just taking this sod cutter right at the edge of this paving to get the mulch down along that layer. So you can see they're mulching this in the main part of the sod in place to avoid disrupting these roots, and just edging the very edge of the soil to keep the mulch from flowing onto the street. So here's a cross section of that, just dropping that grade about 12 inches, I would say, about here, just so that mulch kind of flows down and is equal with the sidewalk. You can see here, if we had a rain event, all this would slide across the sidewalk, and then you've got a maintenance problem. The other thing with mulch around your new planting is you want to pull it back from the crowns of each shrub. So we want that very critical root zone where the stem meets the soil to continue to get air and not get diseased, and not be damp and be prone to diseases and fungus infections. That's a really critical point right there. So none of this where the mulch is up around. And I don't know why, I mean, in my neighborhood, I swear I walk around, we have some common areas and they come and remulch it and they don't do this. So I'm like in front, like pulling mulch back all the time because I can't stand it. Seeing so many plants die on my projects from contractors doing this. So telling you guys, tell them, before you leave, you need to pull the mulch back around all my trees and my plants if they're not doing that. So we're going to go through the sheet mulching period. It's kind of like the lasagna method. We're going to water our turf and then add a layer of newspaper, water it again, and we're going to add a layer of cardboard. You're going to water it again. Sometimes you could put compost on top of it. Sometimes you just add mulch right on top of it, but this is really that compost in place. A lot of times you could be killing the grass with a grass killer first, especially if you have Bermuda, and then slowly composting in place. So if you need cardboard, we have noticed that Costco has lots of cardboard that's been abandoned out in the parking lot. That's a good place to go scour. You can also order regular bee-fluted corrugated paper online. And then for mulch, there's kind of a rule of thumb, 1 1/4 cubic yard. So if you're buying it in bulk, like at El Corazon facility in Oceanside, they're going to ask you how many yards you want. So just a rule of thumb that 1 1/4 cubic yards covers about 100 square feet at 4 inches of depth. There's also mulch calculators where you can go online and say, I have, a 10 by 10, foot area, so 100 square feet, and I want it 3 inches deep, and it will tell you how many cubic yards that is. And if you're going to sheet mulch, you want to warn your neighbors, because in the early stages, it can be quite drastic looking. And so if you have an HOA that is going to write you mean letters, warn them that you're doing this sustainable sheet mulching in place. It's going to look really terrible for about a day while you put all these layers in. And then pretty quickly, once it's mulched, it looks pretty nice and neat. So it's only horrific for the first day or so. It usually takes about 4 to 7 months is what we're seeing to really break down that whole area. So a long time period. You can, if you're going for the turf rebate, you can get extensions and let them know you're going to do the, kind of mulch in place method. And then you can also do kind of the quick planting in place. I don't know why that's not following that. Okay, so we're going to water the mulch when it starts drying out. If we have trees in that area, we're going to make sure that they're continuing to get water while you're mulching in place. Either we would have retrofitted that irrigation zone before we put the mulch down, or we're going to use a soaker hose or something around that tree temporarily until we get it mulched in place. So here's the fast finish method. So you can install your plants and then kind of work around them, and so mulch the areas around. And this works pretty well in conjunction with the rebate area. I found that this newspaper, I had a friend who was Australian, and this is the way they do their weed block. is they put the newspaper down, a few layers. And I did that in my yard. I mean, I didn't see a weed for probably 2 years until this broke down. It was a really effective weed barrier. And then it kind of broke down naturally, and I didn't have all those problems with the weed fabric pulling up as you pull a weed. So one of the reasons we don't recommend that weed fabric is that weeds still can grow in them, and then you start pulling them up and you start pulling all the fabric up. We do recommend it for the rock mulch area because we want to protect that investment of the rocks themselves, which are expensive, and make sure they don't settle down into the soil. So it creates a nice barrier to keep them up high. So this is kind of your fast finish method for sheet mulching. You can see the newspaper down, and then they would put the cardboard down and then the mulch over the top and keep everything wet. And then that would just slowly break down and feed your soil. Okay. We'll have a break, and I'm happy to answer questions. We're at the midway point, and we're doing pretty good on time. So we'll answer some questions, but I think I also want to give them a few minutes so they can run to the restroom or something if they need to.
Okay, that sounds
What time
good.
do you want? What time do you think they should be back? Like 7 minutes or so?
Sure, maybe like right at 10:30.
Okay, sounds good. And then while we're taking a break, any of those who don't need it and have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
We did have one question come in. Someone is looking for water-wise resources for edible gardens. So if you have any recommendations.
Yeah, so we touch on that a little bit in our plant special topic. Generally, our edibles use more water because they're producing, fruit and things. So there are a few species off the top of my head that I can give you. Pomegranates are pretty water conserving. Some of the guavas, we have pineapple guava and strawberry guava are grown in our region that are pretty water efficient. Generally, the thinking with edible plants is even though you're watering them a bit more, you're producing this food. So it's kind of a offset. You're sustainably producing food for your family and not causing other water uses offsite or transportation uses. So we generally, cities would, if you were at a professional level and we're doing a water budget, we would get a credit if we're creating an edible garden for water use. So those are the few off the top of my head that I know are really water conserving. I'm sure there's more. We did touch on that in our plant selection special topic. So that might be one to sign up for. I know the Water Authority has scheduled a number of those out. I think that one's coming up next
We
week.
also have the recording. So if you go to greenoceanside.org, you can see the recordings of the previous 3 workshops that we hosted virtually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good question though.
And then Mona, I will unmute you to ask your question.
Hi, I have a question about the water calculator that actually you presented a couple of workshops ago. On that page, the bewaterwise.com/calculator, it has a different type of the spray heads or the different type of heads. And what I notice is that when I go to the micro spray section, the gallons per hour doesn't fit my gallon per hour. I think mine was higher. So I was wondering if you have recommendations about that.
So good question. And we'll touch on that same watering calculator on this class. So micro sprays are a class of spray heads that are associated with the old kind of point source drip irrigation. So these little button ones, and they're kind of staked in the ground, and it's a tiny little radius that maybe sprays like a foot wide. That's what a micro spray is. And surprisingly, they tend to put a lot of water out. They're not so water conserving, and they break all the time, so not recommended. If you're looking, like, your option is overhead spray, and that's the conventional one. I don't think there's a low precipitation overhead spray option, but what you can do to really dial it in is you could go on the manufacturer's website. Like, say if you have a Hunter MP rotator is your low precipitation nozzle, you can go on their website or look at their catalog, which aren't available. They're not printing too many of those anymore. And you can take the go and find that head on the website, and it'll list the precipitation rate for that particular product. And then on the website, you'll see an option that it either defaults to like 2 gallons per minute, or you can put in the exact precipitation rate for the equipment you're choosing. And so it'll calculate it based on the parameters you put in.
Ah, okay, thank you. I see the app where it says application rate field. Is that where I would put that information in?
Yeah, I think it'll say like inches per hour or precipitation rate or something like that. Do you see an inches per hour? What's the
I
unit?
see an application rate.
Well, let's go through it, and if I feel like I'm doing well on time. Let's do this. If you want to hang around at the end, I'll jump on that site and we'll just look at it together, because I haven't been on the site, actually doing a schedule in a while. They might have changed the way they are inputting, so I want to make sure I'm giving you the right information.
Okay. Thank you.
So we'll do that at the very end if you want to wait around a few minutes.
Yes.
If we're running long.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Mona. And we're good to go. No more questions.
All right. And we got everybody back. Okay, 10:30, off we go. So when you go to a nursery, or when you're thinking about what your plant selection is, know that there's different types of tree trunks you can choose from. So you have standard trunks, which are what we think of as trees, with one long stem and then the head of the tree up higher. You have multi-trunk. So these have multiple branches kind of at the base. Not all species come in multi-trunk. This is a crepe myrtle, so a very nice one to add color, and they come in a range of sizes and pinks and purples and white color flowers. Olive trees a lot of times come this way with multi-trunk, but this is a nice trunk type, especially if you have that condition where you live on a busy street and you really want to create a little area where people aren't walking on the sidewalk and looking directly into like big living room windows. You could put a well-placed small multi-trunk tree out in front and kind of start to block that view into your property and create a little bit more privacy. And then we have what's called full to ground trees. So this is a single trunk like this. We use these a lot for screening. This particular one is a podocarpus, and it has branches all the way to the ground. So it creates a nice screening hedge. This particular one is one of the large varieties of screening of podocarpus, commonly used for screening, but there's also a small variety called Podocarpus maki, M-A-K-I, that works really well at the residential scale. It gets about 3 to 4 feet wide and about, I think, like 10 feet tall. A nice shrub / tree for screening. And then palms. There's a lot of confusion with palms and palm height. So when you're ordering them from a nursery and maybe you want a big specimen, this is kind of how you understand what size of palm you're ordering. This is actually the Mediterranean fan palm, and it comes in a single trunk but has a tendency to actually be in a cluster. I sometimes see these at Home Depot, and these are more water conserving than most of our palms. Also the date palms. Out in India, they grow dates for food. And so once the palms get too high, they sell them off. So if you want a big specimen tree for your palm tree for your landscape, the date palms are readily available and pretty cost effective. In this case, we were actually out in India at the date production agriculture field with a palm broker for this was for a shopping mall, and it was kind of fun. We were tagging trees, and they were pointing out trees that had gotten too tall to make it easy to harvest the dates. So they sell those off and then replant with smaller trees that they don't have to have as much labor to harvest the dates off of. So those, and obviously if you choose a date palm though, mostly females being grown with the fruits being produced. So you've got to come and cut them every year. The males, they just plant at the corners of the field to pollinate the females. So very, very unusual to get a male date palm. But they are nice, readily available and inexpensive and low water. And then this would be our, expensive Canary Island palms that this might be 75 years worth of growth. So if you have a Canary Island palm in your front yard and it's just getting too big and you don't want it, in the past, these have been very desirable for big projects to use. So they would actually go around to people's houses and knock on their door and offer to buy their palms. So you might be able to sell this tree and even a big stand of the Mediterranean fan palms. Some are desirable palms. But we measure height from the ground to the top of the fountain of new growth. And that's called the trunk height. Sometimes it's mistakenly called the brown trunk height, and you can see where the confusion comes, where brown trunk is really just this portion and not when you get to this kind of pineapple part of new growth. With palms, the growth point is at the top, and I have seen landscape maintenance guys do this. They come and trim back the palm and they damage the growth point, and then you lose the tree. This is a really critical zone to protect in all palms. They grow up, and this is really your living part of the tree. If you damage that, you're going to lose it. In our region, we have a new pest that is killing our Canary Island palms, really in South Bay primarily right now, but it's probably going to keep going. So these may not be, they may be losing their desirability in our region because of that pest. And there's not much you can do with it. So anyway, that's your little lesson on palms if they're interested. So when we're selecting healthy plants, we want to look at the roots, the leaves, the trunks, and the bark, look for signs of pests or diseases, and ask lots of questions if you're at a nursery. For the roots, we want to really look at the root system in the container. And you can see this tree is out of its container in the circling root. If we plant that in the ground, the roots are going to continue to circle and get bigger and bigger, and it will choke the tree out. And then we'll have a big tree that dies, and we need to deal with that. So you could save this tree. It would require a lot of corrective pruning to kind of clip these roots and spread them out. It would put the tree in distress for a while. Most trees will pull through as long as you don't try and do this in the height of summer like we have now. And in the times where we're in a bit of a recession and people aren't building landscapes, I see this happen a lot at the nurseries as they don't want to pay to size this tree to a larger container. And you'll see like special magnolia tree and it looks gigantic in the little container. It's usually because the roots are circling it. So beware of those good deals. Understand that if you choose it, you can still work with this tree. You're going to have to do a lot of corrective pruning to get it to be successful in your landscape, and there is a risk you can lose it. On the opposite extreme, I've also seen this. This is actually a tree from one of my projects. And when we bought, these are Tory pines, and when we bought them, we thought they looked a little scrawny and like Charlie Brown Christmas trees, but we were desperate for trees. We had 130 Tory pines we needed, and there just weren't available. It was during the recession, and we kind of got duped by the nursery. So they sold us trees that had the right caliper or width. And then when our contractors put it in, they said the root balls are falling apart. So that's the soil in the container. And we kept losing the trees. And so we called out an arborist and we did a tree autopsy to one that had died. And when we pulled the tree out, the root zone was tiny. In fact, it was so tiny, it was the size of a 15-gallon container. So what we think happened is the nursery they knew we needed these Torrey pines. We were calling all the nurseries, and then they were like, hey, we found some on our back lot. And so we think they were overgrown trees left on the back 40 in 15-gallon containers that had grown too big, and then they hurried up and they threw them in the big containers we needed and tried and sold them to us. And so we had huge tree mortality from nursery practices of them trying to get rid of trees, and that did not go over well for them, and they got in a lot of trouble. And they replaced the trees, and they paid labor to have that done. But as a homeowner, you wouldn't have that sway because you're not building multi-million-dollar landscapes. So check the roots in the container. You can dig down a little bit. You should see the roots all the way to the edge of the container or close to the edge of the container. So it's rooted out, but they're not pushing around the container or circling. You shouldn't see roots coming out of the bottom of the container. That's going to indicate overgrown roots. Also look and make sure that those roots are grown all the way to the edge, because that was my mistake, is I was so used to being sold root down trees. I checked the edge of the container and I didn't see any roots there, and I assumed it was good. But this was the opposite extreme. They had a root girdle thing. They just put it in a big box. So things to watch out for with roots. Leaves should appear healthy and not distorted or undersized or falling off. Obviously, if you're buying a deciduous tree and it's fall, it's starting to get chilly, or late summer and the leaves are falling off, that would be okay, turning yellow, But if you see yellow leaves on a plant that's supposed to be evergreen, this is a sign of like nitrogen starvation. Here's a sign that it wasn't watered and the leaves are drooping down, so it's in water stress. You shouldn't see that at a nursery. That's going to impair that plant. And then this is actually a myoporum, but you can see the curled leaves here. This has to do with a pest called thrips. So this tree has a pest problem. So we want to avoid, if we're buying things at a nursery, we don't want to import a tree or a plant that's got a disease or a pest on it. We want something well maintained. We're also going to look at the bark and the trunk. This example is kind of what we call like a weak union. So this, you can see how scarred the main trunk is, and you've got this really big branch coming out. What happens is there's like a scar that will run all the way down. So the tissue that's alive would actually just be in this outer edge. So as this tree grows, this branch will probably shear off and fall off. And if it's a big tree, it could, damage a car, damage a house, damage a person over time. So we want to avoid any of that kind of, we call narrow crotches, these big branches down low that compete with the main trunk of the tree. Side branches should be pretty small and not have this scarring in the main trunk. This is an example of a trunk. You can see this kind of weeping and oozing. So it's got a disease, a fungal disease, or a viral disease. And so we don't want that. We don't want to take that tree. And unfortunately, I see this all too often because the nursery, I don't know why the nursery guys tie off the trees so tight. They use the expandable horticulture tape, but they tie it so tight they wound the trunk, and then it gets a fungus or a disease, because those fungus and disease spores are always floating around. They're just looking for an opportunity to take hold. So check the trunk for any signs of infection, especially around where they put the green horticultural tape or any ties to the nursery stake, and make sure you're not getting a diseased plant. If there's some small broken twigs or branches, that's usually acceptable because we can correctively prune those. We want to make sure that the central leader, the central trunk of our tree is nice and strong, and that the branches that spin around, that come off of that are you know, nicely spaced in proportion to that trunk. We want to try and make sure that there's no pests or diseases. So here we've got some kind of a pest eating the leaves. Here, this is a viral disease. This is peach leaf curl. If you have a stone fruit, it's just so common in our region. You kind of have to live with it while it's producing fruit. And then in the kind of winter dormant season, we actually would spray the trunk with a dormant oil to try and reduce the amount of that virus on the tree. Here's a good example of this. Is a tree they tried to send to my project site, and luckily I went out to the nursery and rejected it. But you can see the where the horticultural tape was, and this disease, I was on a sycamore, was caused by tape that was too tight, and it just, you know, created a wound. And then, you know, one of these diseases that exist all around us took advantage of that, and was a problem. I would have imported at this project site in particular. This is the new Naval Hospital at Camp Pendleton. Our main central plaza has sycamores that they were 30 feet high when we put them in. They were huge, 72-inch box specimens. This was a smaller sycamore, and I would have imported a disease onto my project site. So I didn't want to do that. So, you know, if you're at a nursery, make sure, you know, to not take the one that's diseased. So reputable nurseries employ very knowledgeable staff. They're very familiar with the plants they carry. You can tell them about your conditions. They can tell you what they've seen work well for them, or, you know, what they know will do well in that condition. And generally, local nurseries are going to stock plant material that does well in our region. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that, you know, they're going to limit your choices to things they know are successful. And then if we've got compaction on our site, and a lot of us do, a lot of us are dealing with past construction influence from building our house, where they've brought in big equipment and they, you know, they've put water trucks down and it's rained and they've driven over it, and then they pull off, and then they're like, okay, now plant it and make things grow. But if the soil's compacted, it's going to be really difficult to get plants started. And so the ways you might remediate that compaction is we're going to add compost to the soil, either as a compost soil amendment or on the top as a mulch. So in the ground, if we're doing new planting and we're digging a hole, you know, a hole for a container, we can amend the backfill, dig that native soil out, amend the backfill, and then use it to fill back in the hole. If we have that condition where there's existing trees or some other reason, existing plant material that we can't get in the ground, we can mulch on top of the ground. And it takes longer to remediate compaction by mulching on top of the ground, but eventually the inorganics and things will get pulled into the soil and start to aggregate the soil. I'm going to give you an example, show you an example. At Southwestern College, we have a clay soil there. So you can see these big clods. Actually, if I went out there now, it would be like one giant clod for this whole thing. But not good infiltration with the high clay content creates these big dense clods, and that makes it difficult for plants to grow. This was right next to where I took that soil sample from, and you can see these nice aggregates in there, and you can see it's a darker brown color. So that's the organic matter, the broken down compost amendment. In this area, this is by our garden. The college only put wood chips down. It wasn't even a mulch amendment. And this was about 2 years of wood chip mulch being on top. which takes a lot longer to break down, but you can still see that it's really improved the soil out there. It's got this healthy aggregation, so water can move through the soil, reducing the compaction. It also, those aggregates will keep a glaze of water and nutrients up closer to the plants, but not saturated, so that the plants can grab water and air when they need it. So compost does wonders. Compost comes as we talked about, the finely screened stuff, or you can order it as a mulch. This is the same process, but now you've just got a mulch topping. They screen it, so this is the bigger stuff, goes in one pile. But it's already been through this process of starting to break down. So if you're using your basic kind of Mediterranean or horticultural plants, and so you're digging down your hole, you kind of put the backfill, dig the soil, the native soil off to one side. For our traditional plants, our low water and horticultural plants, we're going to use about 30% volume of compost being added to that. If we have native plants or very low water plants, like those very arid climate succulents, we're going to use less compost, so 15%. And that's going to just be enough to get the soil biology going, but not keep too much water close to the roots for those plants. They don't like wet roots. They're not adapted to that climate. As we talked about, our native plants hold onto their leaves really tightly, and they don't drop them to create organic matter. So our soil tends to be just mineral in our region. We might have a quarter, an eighth of an inch of topsoil, versus if you went back to Illinois, you might have 4 or 6 inches of topsoil. So very different growing conditions. Again, the amendment is available in bags at a big box store or in bulk. And then, so looking at planting, we've got, if we're planting our ground covers that spread by rooting, we're going to remove our turf completely, and we might rototill some of the compost in. So I like to put about, if I have regular, water-thirsty ground cover, or not water-thirsty, but traditional ground cover, I might put 3 inches of compost on top, and then use a rototiller to get it down into the soil profile about 6 inches. We don't want to rototill all the time. We just want to do it once to break up the compaction and start getting that healthy aggregation going. And then we're going to plant the ground cover, and I like to include about a 1-inch layer of mulch around it. I find that continues to feed the plant, break down and feed the soil around the plants, but it's not enough to impair the little runners from rooting in. So that, I just have seen pretty good success, so I recommend that. So ground covers, spreading ground covers do require contact with the mineral part of the soil, not just the mulch. So that's why I use a very thin layer. For planting a hole for a shrub, a container, we're going to dig the hole twice as wide as the container and just only as deep as the container. And the reason we only dig it as deep as the container is we want to make sure that this critical point where the stem meets the soil is not sinking down into the soil and getting wet. So we want that to be on a stable, regular compaction and not loosened. And so we want to keep that up out of soil, water and moisture. If you have a slow draining soil, like maybe a clay soil, you might even plant the plant about 1/2 inch high just to protect that area from getting moist. And then you can see that the native soil's been dug out, and then there's compost has been added, and that soil is used to replace. Newer recommendations say just in the upper half to add amendment in, that they worry about too much compost being too low, creating anaerobic conditions. I haven't found personally that it seems to make much difference. I do now try and just fill, you know, if I'm planting in my own yard, I do try and just fill the bottom of the hole with native soil and try and just amend the top portion. If you had a slope condition, so this is what we call a 2-to-1 slope, that's our typical manufactured slope. You would steepen the area behind your plant hole, which is still twice as wide as the container. So smaller containers are much easier to install on slopes than big containers. So probably focusing on the little 1-gallon ground covers or shrubs to start with, because it's just going to be easier to get that on the slope and not dig out as much soil. But you can see it gets a little bit steeper here, and then you've got your basin around the plant, and then the soil that was dug out here ends up in front, so it creates a little basin around that soil to support the plant while it's establishing. And then for trees, also, we still don't dig it deeper than the container that we're planting. We talked about it, the trees or shrubs, larger shrubs, come with a nursery stake and it's tied off. So we want to make sure to remove those and then install 2 new stakes to support that tree. So we use kind of lodgepole stakes with these very flexible kind of rubber, it's almost like rubber bands that are big, and you can see we're not tying the tree to the stake. We're just keeping it upright so that the tree can be self-supporting and its trunk can grow wider and create a nice strong trunk. So we don't want to tie it off to a stake. We want the trunk to develop its thickness and support its weight on its own. And then after about a year, we take those stakes out if we can, you know, and make sure that if we don't want the plant to be bending over. So that's why we double stake it. So again, hole twice as wide as the container, and that's the part where we would amend the soil. So here's a couple examples of how we might support a new tree. You can see the stakes are located outside that root ball of the container. And here's one of the kind of flexible ties. So this tree is pretty much self-supporting, but if it gets a little bit of an onshore breeze, it might bend over if that trunk is kind of small and new. So we just use the double stake to try and not have it be impacted by the wind, or give it a little extra support while it's adjusting to not having that nursery stake in it anymore. Bigger trees, you can use guy wires to stabilize that tree. Those can be a tripping hazard around public walkways or sidewalks, so just be careful with your guy wires. Go that route. We want to mulch over the top of our new planting. Again, we're going to pull the mulch back from any of these root crowns, but mulching prevents erosion, helps reduce evaporation, it helps reduce weeds, and starts to remediate compaction. So mulching is a great thing. And then it will, if we're using that blended mulch, then it will start to break down and feed the soil quickly. So we want that soil building type of mulch if we're trying to support our healthy soil. So usually a brush or chipped mulch or blended mulch. These varieties have not gone through the composted process. So they're fresh clippings that are, plant materials delivered to the, like say the landscape recycling facility, and they chop it all up. And this has the woody part, the leaves, the stems, it might have grass clippings. So it's blended, and then it breaks down kind of more quickly. That's opposed to just the wood mulch. And the wood mulch is just the trunks and 2x4s and just the woody part of plants. That doesn't break down very quickly to support healthy soil and reduce compaction. That does work really well for some maintenance tasks and things where you want that mulch not to disappear into the soil and have to replenish it all the time. So I would say a brush or a chip mulch is probably going to last you about a year, maybe 2, and then it'll get thin and you'll have to replenish that. A wood mulch is going to last longer, but it's not going to feed the soil quickly. What's nice about these brush or chip mulches too is that it holds in place on slopes. So you can lay it over a 2-to-1 slope and it won't slide off. If we use just the wood mulch or the bark nuggets, things like that, it just slides off. It doesn't become a blanket that stays in place. So it can be an erosion control method too. We're going to adjust the irrigation of our existing trees and large plants we want to keep. In this case, we're taking our spray system and converting it to drip. Let's do a quick show you how quickly it is to convert these things. First, get it up. So I've got a regular pop-up. This part would be buried in the soil, but you can see the body, and it's got this pop-up head on it. I could get the system going. They either make these little clamps, or you could have your kids run out and grab the sprinklers, or carefully pull it up when the system's off. And you can, I'm holding it up right now, and it's pretty easy to just change out the nozzle to a different, maybe a low precipitation nozzle. It's that simple to do a nozzle retrofit. We need to make sure it's the same radius and the same arc of distribution, that you can simply retrofit your system by just changing out the nozzle. And there are rebates that are just nozzles. And if you're doing a turf rebate, you can do a turf rebate and a nozzle rebate and a smart controller rebate. You can do several. So explore what's out there. But if we wanted to take that same overhead spray system and convert it to a drip, Rainbird makes this really great Retro 1800 that we can convert. So it's the spray body, if you have at least a 6-inch deep spray body, you can reuse this and not even have to dig this part up. But the other, you could just pull the guts out of the other one and then drop in these new guts, or you could add the whole new assembly. But it's got a filter and a pressure regulator right in it. So it converts your overhead spray into a drip system. And then you can attach the inline drip tubing, or the spaghetti tubing has different fittings on top, and do an easy conversion. Just make sure that when you convert, you have to convert all, either cap or convert all the heads on the system to drip, because overhead spray and drip have very different run times. So we can't get the scheduling right if you have spray and drip on the same system. So here's our different types of irrigation spray. I think I jumped ahead, sorry. So advantages of overhead spray: simple to retrofit. Some choices can nearly match the precipitation rate of drip. Simpler to troubleshoot than drip. Provides good distribution uniformity for ground cover establishment. So if you're removing turf out and you're replacing it with just a low water ground cover, and you're not really changing the grade by creating mounds or swales, this might be a really easy retrofit to just change out the nozzles. So we want that turf-like substitute, and we have small plugs of planting that will spread out. If we have an existing system with good coverage, you might want to think about retaining your overhead spray. Even if you have larger plants, you can get these heads that are 12-inch pop-ups, so they're deeper, so it can get the spray up and over larger shrubs. And then you've got inline, so different types of drip. You've got your inline drip, which is designed for on the surface or subsurface, below the surface. I like the on the surface application and then cover it with mulch so you can find the lines again without having to dig down into the soil. The point source is what I showed you earlier. These are these little button emitters. These tend to be very prone to failure and become very maintenance intensive from my experience. So they're out there. A lot of people are comfortable with them, but you're going to have to check them all the time to make sure that they haven't popped off on all these little fittings, or that these have little stakes that need to stay above the ground, so they shouldn't be resting on the ground. There's no check valve to keep them from getting clogged. So if they're laying on the ground, they can get dirt or bugs in them and clog up. And then bubblers are considered a low precipitation product also. So drip is the most efficient irrigation type. It reduces weed growth by targeted water application, prevents runoff and erosion because it is so low flow. And if you lay it on the surface, you don't have a lot of trenching, which saves on labor. Usually more costly from an equipment standpoint. So use a drip retrofit when you have a mix of plant material sizes and types, or if you've added a lot of hardscape or walkways, if you're creating mounds or swales, when combining plants with different water needs, especially your existing plants with new lower water varieties. And I see that come up a lot with our participants of our 4-class series, where they might have an island of like palms and more tropical looking plants in the center of the lawn, and then they want to remove the lawn and then put lower water use plants around that. We can more easily accommodate those two different hydrozones with drip irrigation, because we can add more lines with more emitters around that area that needs a little bit more water. So it's a little more forgiving with mixing hydrozones. So great step-by-step. I know I showed you quickly how the retrofit works, but this is the Retro 1800 product. A lot of contractors are not aware of that product being on the market. It's a really great solution at the residential level. There is YouTube videos with step-by-step guides. I think this is also posted in our resources section and readily available online. But you know, great system for the residential market, and you can get fittings that are compatible either with the bigger inline drip or the spaghetti tubing drip irrigation. And then irrigation scheduling. And this is a big question that I get a lot. It's kind of what plant should I use and how long should I run my irrigation? And both of those are not easily answered. So for irrigation scheduling, both of those have site-specific information to be able to answer it easily. They're easily answered, but you got to have a lot of information. So irrigation scheduling, we need to know what climate we're in, what our soil texture is, and our infiltration rate, what type of irrigation equipment that we're scheduling for, and what is our plant use. And once we know those factors, then we can create an irrigation schedule. So we also need to know how deep we are currently watering or need to water. So if we want to be familiar with what our root zone depth is. If we have an area of healthy plants, we want to check what the depth is. Like if we're going to convert our system, you can take a soil core or dig down carefully and see after your irrigation runs, maybe it gets 6 inches deep or 8 inches deep. So we want to try and maintain that depth of watering. And we load kind of those instructions into our controller program. So our controller program is a set of instructions that's stored in there. It includes things like what days are we watering, and what times are we watering, and how long are we watering. And it's also a smart control is going to start adjusting for seasonal changes. So we actually have generally 3 different irrigation schedules. We have our summer schedule, which is what we would have right now for peak demand. And then we have our winter schedule, which is our low demand. And then in the middle, in fall and spring, we have a moderate water demand. So smart controllers, some of the newer ones will automatically adjust based on weather monitoring or historic weather data stored in the controller. And others you might need to adjust the schedule manually. So for help developing a water schedule, there's a great tool on bewaterwise.com or SoCal Water. Those kind of go to the same spot. And you're going to scroll down and you're going to find this area that says watering index. And you can see when I pulled this screenshot, it was probably spring or fall, because the percentage of maximum water used for plants was at 52%. If I went in there today, and we've got a question to do this at the end, we'll go on to this at the end and look at it together. If I do it today, probably it's going to be around 92% or 89% of maximum, maybe even higher, because we're in a bit of a heat spell. And right next to it, you can click on this watering calculator. And that calculator is going to show you, it's going to ask you for information like your zip code, which is going to tell it your climate and your evapotranspiration rate, or how much water generally uses in that zip code. It's going to ask you for your soil type, what type of planting you're going to put in, what water use, is it low, medium, high water use, very low water use. It's going to ask you for what type of irrigation, and then it'll have a spot that you can either use a default precipitation rate, or how much water that pulls out, puts out, or you can override it and put in the manufacturer data. And it's going to spit out a schedule that looks a bit like this. So you can see this is for ground cover, probably what I named the zone, low water use, and a drip emitter with 1.00 gallons per hour. So it's going to tell me the recommended maximum runtime. That's going to be based on my soil texture. If I have a very clay soil, I'm going to have a very short maximum runtime. And then that'll get saturated, and it'll need time for the water to sink in. And I might, if I have a really heavy demand water user plant, I might have to run that zone in what's called split cycling, meaning I might have to run that 2 or 3 times during the day and let it rest between each time to let the water get into the soil. It's going to give me the recommended start times per week, and then what the total minutes per week that are required. So you can see when we're in January and December on this one, we have like 32 minutes. That's our low season water demand. And right now in July, it's 112 minutes. And then, spring and summer is down to 64. So you've got those kind of 3 schedules throughout the year. So hopefully you upgrade your controller to a smart controller so you don't have to go out there for maximum water efficiency and keep changing your schedule by hand. So irrigation scheduling, the best technology is only as smart as the person operating it, and it doesn't replace knowledge and attention. So you can start this scheduling feature is a nice place to start, but you still need to keep an eye on your plant. And you need to go out and check, how deep is it watering? Is it watering in that root zone that historically it has been? Or maybe it's watering too long and I can turn it down a little bit. Or maybe it's not watering enough and I need to turn it up a little bit. So I'm going to quickly, I've got a small controller here. Hunter was nice enough. Hunter is one of our local manufacturers, one of the few local manufacturers in our region. So they have great support, great tech line support. But you can see this is kind of their basic, this is their X-Core model. It doesn't tie into like smartphones and things, like they have a new Hunter HC that will actually tie into your home automation and the Nest, and you can adjust it on your app. But this does have a certain level of smart features. You can attach what is called a solar sink to it, which monitors the sunlight intensity and the rainfall and the heat, and it will adjust with that solar sink. It also has a seasonal adjust per percentage. At the very least, whatever control you have should have a seasonal adjust. So if I switch it to that, I set the controller up for 100%. So my worst case, like in July, watering, and then I can go to the seasonal adjust and say, okay, now it's spring, I just need to adjust the percentage down. So it's a pretty easy way to reschedule seasonally for your controller instead of having to reprogram it every time the season changes, which would be a nightmare. So at the very least, make sure your controller has that percent seasonal adjust. Anything that has been produced since the last drought is going to have that, because they have to be water efficient. But if you have a controller that's 20 or 30 years old and doesn't have that, I would say, look at the smart controller rebates out there and maybe think about replacing your controller. Okay, so some resources for implementation. You have manufacturer catalogs and websites. They have a lot of great resources that they've developed both for the residential consumer and the professionals. Professional suppliers. So there's our big box stores don't really sell professional grade equipment. They sell kind of stuff that's cheap. So we recommend buying equipment at professional supply houses. I think I have a slide on this. I'll also show you where this resources guide is that has some of those references. You have a homeowner's guide that we talked about. So there's some resources in there, and also the Sustainable Landscape Guide has a lot of resources. BeWaterwise.com has a lot of resources. Workshops, even Home Depot does some nice, well, they did prior to COVID-19, some nice workshops. Maybe those will come back. Lots of YouTube videos out there, so good places to look. So big box stores have very limited professional grade equipment. You want to really buy your irrigation equipment at a professional supply house. So these are the ones generally in our region. It's Grangetto's. They're very helpful to the residential climate. So Grangetto's Farm and Garden Supply. I know the residential people we've talked to really enjoy. It's kind of just like a nice day trip out there too. They have all kinds of farm equipment, farm stuff too. So very residential friendly. You can also go into Site One, Ewing, Imperial, and Horizon. These are professional landscape supply houses where the contractors would buy in our region. The difference is that they're going to have things like pressure regulators built into the heads, and that's important for water conservation and proper operation. The professional supply stuff usually has a thicker wall, so it's going to be less prone to breaking. So even though it costs a little bit more, you won't have to replace it as often if your pressure is being managed well. And we talk about pressure regulation a lot in the irrigation class. But yeah, anyway, we recommend buying equipment. Make the trip to a professional house, supply house. And then for implementation, are you a do-it-yourselfer or you want some professional support? Sometimes you can balance and do some pieces for yourself and then hire out other pieces. And it's really a trade-off between cost versus your labor and time. So for design, to get some support, you can look at the American Society of Landscape Architects, the San Diego chapter. They have a page on consumer resources, and they keep a list of people that tend to work residentially. Know that landscape architects they're professionally licensed like architects and engineers, and we tend to work, personally, I tend to work on projects that are bigger, that maybe need permitting through the city. Maybe they have site problems like grading and drainage problems or need retaining walls. There are some of my colleagues who do small single family residential, but not a lot of them. I think because we are professionally licensed, we can be a little bit more expensive than some of the designers. Some of them charge actually more than I do, so I guess that's not a catch-all, but some do not. So I think with anything, whether you're hiring a contractor or designer, price doesn't always guarantee that you're going to get good or bad quality. You really need to do your research. So one resource if you want design help is American Society of Landscape Architects. Again, we're licensed. Most of us have big insurance policies. All that costs money, so we tend to charge a little bit more overall, I'm going to say. Association of Professional Landscape Designers, APLD has a San Diego chapter. They have a Find a Designer near you. The thing to know about landscape designers is some are really done their homework. They're very talented designers. They're taken a lot of classes in horticulture and design, and some have not. Some have never taken a formal class at all. They're just kind of creative people. So do your research. They are not regulated by the state. They're considered unlicensed professionals. So there's not much recourse if something goes wrong. Certified irrigation, but there's some very talented designers. I teach a lot of people who become landscape designers. APLD is an organization that has their own internal kind of review standards. So some people can be an APLD certified designer. And again, there's some really, really talented designers out there. So they run the gamut. So just, I think with anybody, do your homework, contractors or designers. Certified irrigation designer, if you need help with just the irrigation, redesigning that system, you can go on the Irrigation Association website, which is irrigation.org, and they keep a list of irrigation designers. For installation and repair, California Landscape Contractors Association, CLCA San Diego chapter keeps a list of contractors that work residentially in our region. Same Irrigation Association, you can find people who install irrigation systems. There's a lot of YouTube videos. Anybody who's licensed, so that would include your landscape contractors and people installing irrigation, should have a license, and you can check the status of their license at the Contractor State Licensure Board. There's a consumer site. You can Google someone by their company name, their personal name, their license number. All licensed people, contractors, are required to list their license on every piece of paper they give you. If they give you a business card, it needs to have their license number. If they give you a proposal, it needs to have their license number. If they drive a truck with their company sign, it needs to have their license number. If they have a website, it needs to have a license number. So you should be readily able to find that license number. For landscape architects, we don't have to put our license number on everything, but you can go on to the Landscape Architects Technical Committee, which is our state oversight, and Google the name of the designer you maybe are thinking about working on and make sure that they don't have any complaints against them. So that you can search by name or license number. So, because we had one participant who hired an unlicensed contractor and things went sideways, I want to just talk to you a little bit about what state law requires and just give you some cautions, and then it's up to you. I know we have a huge amount of landscape community that work unlicensed, and if you choose to work with them, that's fine. I think there's some people who are very knowledgeable and they haven't taken the steps to get their license, but I just want you to understand where where the state helps you, where you're at risk, what the risks are a little bit more. So state law requires use of a licensed landscape contractor for work in excess of $500. Contractors must list their license number on their business cards, advertisements, websites, and proposals. Precautions: make sure to check the contractor's license to make sure it's active, in good standing. That means that they have all their insurance up to date, right? They've paid their state licensure fee, and they've had to submit copies of their insurance to be in good standing. They will also record any complaints that have been filed against them that are publicly available. So they've gone through the period of investigating and said, yes, this was a claim, this was a problem, and it's tied to their record. Make sure that the license number matches who you're negotiating with. I've seen some people use another person's license without their knowledge. I've seen some people use their uncle's, license. So make sure that if you're negotiating with someone, that license is in their name or the head of the company. Maybe they're a sales support for a company that has a licensed person. And then ask for client references. That's always a good idea whenever you're talking about spending a lot of money, and then follow through by checking with the references. So things that can go wrong when hiring an unlicensed contractor. They may not obtain the city permits or community approval that is required. Ultimately, you are responsible for repairs to correct unpermitted or unapproved work. I have a client right now, and I feel for them. They had twin boys, and they had this idea that the slope behind their house was really steep, and they wanted to make it less steep. And their neighbors recommended a contractor that they'd worked with, and that contractor came in and started building gabions, which are kind of cages of stone, and they filled the canyon in, except for the canyon was all habitat, and you can't fill in the canyon to make a more flat surface. So the contractor started building this without any permits. One of the other neighbors called the city and reported them. The inspectors came out, and the contractor took off with their money, and they have been in litigation with the city for 5 years. The city has filed paperwork to go after their house, and they are working with a civil engineer and me to try and do an entire restoration of the habitat on that slope. And that work should be finished up in fall before they go to hearing and the city takes their house away. But huge amount of money to correct that problem. And they'll probably get it corrected and save their house. But that's the things that could go wrong. A licensed contractor would know you can't fill in the canyon behind your house without huge repercussions. They could leave a project incomplete after you've paid them. Very famous tactic for pool contractors. They'll just dig a big hole and walk away. If their workers are injured, you may be held responsible or risk having a claim filed against your homeowner's policy, because an unlicensed person probably does not have any insurance claims. They could, theoretically, you hold the insurance policy, and they could come after your homeowners and file a claim. So those are your risks, and you guys do what you want to do. So, but be very careful and research your people well. Okay, general plant maintenance. So we're going to amend, and this is step 6. So we've almost made it through. Let's see. Okay, we're in good time. You're going to amend with soil, amend soil with compost and mulch regularly. So that could be if you're replacing annual beds or edibles, we can work the compost into the soil. If not, we could use that composted mulch over the top of the soil. We might need to add some amendments. So maybe we have, citrus plants that are using a lot of the iron and the micronutrients, or they need more of the food because they're getting depleted. We would amend with those. We're going to remove any weeds. And one of the benefits to all this amending the soil is when you have a healthy soil, it's not prone to weeds in our region. So if you drive around our region and you see a recent road cut, where maybe they are doing some work, and you come back a few months later, there's usually weeds all over that. And that's because once we disturb the soil and disrupt the soil biology, weeds actually come in and they grow quick and they create a lot of organic material. And their job is to actually contribute a lot of organic material to get the system restarted. So we can cut that part of the system out if we're amending our soil and make that soil less attractive to weeds. We're going to monitor and treat pests and monitor plant health. So when you're in plant maintenance, we like to recommend the use of integrated pest management. And what this means is we use chemical controls as a last resort. So our first step would be inspection and identification of pests. So we know what we're working with and what strategies might be successful. We're going to start with a hard spray of water and see if just disrupting them with water might be enough to kill them or get them to move off to your neighbor's yard. Then you can move on to like an insecticidal soap or other non-toxic type pest killers. And then chemical controls come as a last resort. So if you need to use chemical controls, you're not going to want to apply them like this. You're going to want to have your full protective gear on. You're going to follow the manufacturer instructions carefully. You're going to wear protective gloves, clothing, glass.
Michelle, I'm not sure if it's just me, but I've lost my audio on you. Oh, yeah, other people have too.
Uh-oh.
Oh, now you're back.
Is it back?
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm wondering if it's a glitch with the internet. So where did you lose me at?
Just like 30 seconds ago on this slide.
Okay. So when you apply chemical controls, you're going to not want to do it like this lady and have some protective gear on, clothing on, because this can get absorbed through your skin. So you're going to want to protect yourself. And one thing is to consider replacing pest-prone plants with another species, so you don't have to go to chemical controls. But when you go to chemical controls, you're going to follow all the manufacturer's instructions, wear your protective clothing, and only apply it when weather permits. So if it's really hot like it is now, or windy, or really cold, you're gonna want to not apply. And the manufacturer's instructions will tell you when it's safe to apply. And you're gonna want to follow the concentration dosing rate and not use a higher concentration. Again, we already talked about that's the biggest pollution into our watershed is people who are not trained pesticide applicators mixing higher concentrations and using them in their yards. So don't be part of that problem. For tree maintenance, we're going to trim, shape, and selectively prune the trees to keep it a safe, good-looking tree. And we can either do that in young trees by ourselves, and as it gets bigger, you might want to hire an arborist every few years to kind of lace the tree and reduce the canopy weight. Control pests and diseases as needed. Remove all dead, diseased, or damaged branches back to a side branch. You're going to check the tree strakes frequently. So a new tree we've double staked or we've put guy wires on, we've removed that nursery stake. And we want to remove the tree stakes and ties as soon as the tree itself is self-supporting. And on my professional projects, invariably that's the thing that just drives, just the contractors forget to do that, you know, and I go out to my site and have a big, beautiful Torrey pine that's establishing, and I walk up and the guy wires have just cut into the tree and the tree is trying to grow around them, and it could compromise the tree. So you as a homeowner, make sure you're checking those ties and it's not damaging the trunk, and just remove the stakes if it doesn't need it anymore. So we've got rebates available right now. So there's the SoCalWatersmart.com. They have a turf removal rebate, rotating sprinkler nozzle, that's the low precipitation, weather-based irrigation controllers, rain barrels and cisterns, soil moisture sensor systems. Make sure you don't remove your turf until you receive a notice to proceed. So there are, you know, you've got to submit a bunch of data and pictures and a basic plan, but just don't stop watering or remove your turf until you hear back from your application. And I don't know what happened. I had some more slides, more than trees. I'm sorry, I'm gonna go out of full screen. Well, I had a few more slides about other maintenance. I am going to jump. I think when I popped the new slides in, I might have lost some of the other slides. So I'm going to jump to another presentation real quickly and find those slides again. I apologize.
That's okay. And they're also in the slides that were sent
The
out.
old one? Yeah, so I guess it must have accidentally deleted more than I thought. What's going on? Where's my curriculum? Here we go. Found it. Okay.
We're getting a lot of great questions, so thank you everybody
Uh-oh.
for submitting those, and we will get to
Do-
some questions.
Do we want to take a break before I'm going to switch over? Let's see, there's probably like 10 slides left. So is it a good time to take a break, or you want to wait till the end?
We can take a break if that works for you, because there's quite a few.
Yeah,
and
okay.
then, like, around
I've got the other one up, so I can play with. Okay, let's answer questions, and then I'm going to probably just copy the other slides. Let me copy the other slides into this one. I apologize, everyone. As I said, I updated the website, and I must have accidentally deleted a bunch of slides. There's my slides back. Good. Get back into full screen mode. Maybe. Okay, and I think I'm going to do the duplicate. Full screen mode. So let's take some questions, and then we'll finish out these 10 slides and then jump on a couple of the websites.
Okay, perfect. So first question is, do you trim the Queen Anne palms the same way as the other palms that you were showing earlier?
Yeah,
Because
so
the
any
top of the trunk is a little different, I guess.
Yeah, so any palm, the terminal growth point where the fountain of new growth comes out, its only growth point. So if you go in and start trimming around that growth point, you could lose the palm. So you're really just taking the lower fronds that are kind of drooping down and turning brown, and any seed or flower, spikes that come out of it. But you want to avoid messing with that top growth point to protect your tree. And in that case, yes, that's where palms are similar. When you saw the Canary Island palm and it's got those kind of pineapple things, that's more typical to the big kind of date palms, Canary Island palms, where you cut them back and they're still kind of living for a while up there, and then those will die back. But you're never messing with that top new fountain of growth. Good question.
Okay, and then another person is asking, is soft water bad for plants over a long time?
Yeah, soft water is generally done by adding salt. And we talked about Roundup being basically a salt to kill your plants. So yes, salt water would not be good for your plants. You're going to want a basic potable water system, or take something to remove the salt out for best plant growth. I'm not sure how much salt would be in soft water, but my guess is it's pretty high. So it's not a good source for landscape. So you'd probably want to tie into your service line and bring a line back and tie in. If you have soft water and your irrigation is tied goes through your house and then comes out the back wall, and that's where you tied onto it, you might want to invest in creating a lateral or a main line back from the service line and converting it so that it's taking water before it goes through your soft water system.
Okay. Next question is the rule for small plants that roots should not be circling when bought in a pot also apply to trees?
Yeah, so any circling roots is applicable to any container plant. So trees, small shrubs, ground covers, you don't want to see some of the little, like small ones like you get at Home Depot, you take them out, they grow so fast just in the time they've been sitting at Home Depot, they're circling, and you can carefully untangle those roots and, you know, spread them out before you plant it. For trees and things, the bigger shrubs, it's a bigger problem, right? You know, like that one had the really circling roots. If we were to just stick that in a hole, those roots would continue to circle and just get bigger, and eventually what they call girdle the tree and choke that tree out and kill it. So really important to do some corrective root pruning. If you make the choice to buy a tree that's maybe a really big tree in a pot that's too small and the nursery's clearing it out, just know you're going to have to do some corrective root pruning before you plant it to make sure that tree grows into a healthy one. It can be done, it's just an extra step that needs to happen. And if you don't do it in the right season and you don't do it carefully, you could lose that tree.
Okay. Next question is it better to water in the day or night?
So generally we like to water early morning. And the reason is that if we water earlier in the evening, the plants stay wet long and they get more prone to like fungal infections like powdery mildew and some of our rust. If we're watering early in the morning, we have less evaporation loss, and then the sun comes out and it dries the plant leaves off, so you're not as prone to developing infections.
Perfect. You said the whole system has to be drip or spray, but if you have a multi-station system, is it that every head in the particular station needs to be drip, but the other stations can still be spray?
Yeah, so good question. So on one irrigation zone, so when you cycle through your different zones, each zone needs to be a comparable distribution system. So if you have like your lawn and you turn it up and it's all pop-up sprays and you decide to do a drip conversion, you either need to cap or convert every head on that system. You can't convert it to drip and leave some heads overhead spray. So it's just each zone needs to be similar.
Great. And then this person has 35 potted plants in her garden. They are mixed together. Some need to be watered twice per week and some once. So is it possible that you can use one drip system to work for both needs? And if not, what should she do?
Yeah, so what I would do is I would, on the plants that maybe you're going to have to pick 2 days or 1 day a week to water. So I would go with the 2 days a week per water. But then on the plants that need 50% less water, or usually you only water once a week, I would put drip emitters that are half the size of the ones that need more water. So the system's running twice a week. So I'm assuming you have one zone for all these like drip irrigation in the plants. Say the ones that need lots of water, maybe you have a 2 GPM drip emitter, and the ones that don't need a lot water have half of that, like a 1 GPM drip emitter. Then you're running it twice a week, but the ones that need less water are getting half as much water. Or you could create 2 zones, one going on twice a week and one going on once a week. But you have to add a whole valve zone and everything for that.
Great, that's a good solution. Okay.
Yeah.
Next question is, what do brown rose leaves indicate?
And so brown rose leaves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So generally, when I see that, I mean, there's a lot of things that it can indicate, but I would say most common in our region, when we see leaves turning brown, starting at their tips and moving towards the plant, that usually means that there's a lot of the alkalinity or the salinity of the soil is increased. So we got to like kind of flush the salts down. And you can do that by a little bit of gypsum, right? Like the powdered sugar coating of gypsum, and amend that in. That will help to loosen some of those salts and flush it down. We usually see plants that are prone to that, like Japanese maples. I see have a lot of what's called salt burn by this time in summer. I actually saw my neighbors had a beautiful Japanese maple in a big pot, and in summertime they loaded up on a rolling cart and they put it in their garage, almost like if you were in a cold climate, you would take your citrus and bring it inside, right? So it's not frozen. But I would guess, just based on the browning leaves, it's probably a salt burn. So leaching is kind of putting some applications of water, maybe, 1 week, start irrigating around it, an inch of water every maybe 3 or 4 times a week, add the gypsum and then start leaching around and see if you can't get the salts flushed further into the soil where it's not right around the plant root zone. And you see it a lot in potted plants too, will get that leaf burn. That'd be my best guess without seeing a leaf. Otherwise, you can take it into like Walter Anderson's help desk and ask for some direction.
Great. Okay, do you have any fertilizer recommendations for potted plants?
So some potted plants need, like maybe if they're flowering potted plants, they need more of one of those NPK. So you see the 5, 15, 15, 15, or they have all these different number combinations. And I don't remember if it's the phosphorus or the potassium that it needs more of. So maybe do a little research or go into a good help desk. But you're going to want to pick your supplemental fertilizer based on, are you trying to do fruit and flowering? So there's a lot of energy used to produce those things. Or is it just a general, low fertilizer just to keep it healthy? Or does it use a lot of nitrogen? It seems like the citrus uses a lot of nitrogen. And so you can get a mix for that. I like the slow release fertilizers. So the Osmocote is one that I use that's at Home Depot. And it little pellets, and they release very slowly, and they have a formulation for flowering plants and they have a regular formulation. So maybe look for something like that. You shouldn't have to amend it, add that more than like once a year. You want to avoid the like Miracle Grow magic blue water. That's like feeding your plants like candy bars, right? So it grows really big and beautiful right before the garden show, and then 2 weeks later they're like halfway dead. So it's like a sugar high for plants. You want to try and get like a really stable food supply for those plants to create your strongest, healthiest plants that are going to weather pests and drought impacts. They're actually going to build a thicker wall to the plants and be more resilient. Make, the bug lands on it. There's still these, pests all around, but when they try and chew into the leaves, it's kind of thicker wall, and they're like, I don't like that one so much. I'm going to go fly to the neighbor's yard using the magic blue water. And then they have a very thin, unhealthy cell wall, and it's going to be easier to attack that plant. So when we have that good soil biology, we're actually creating a much healthier plant that can weather pests and diseases in low water.
She has a follow-up too to that. So the pots have mulch, and she's wondering how to give this like pellet version that you're talking about, or if she can give it to pots with mulch.
In the mulch, so normally we replenish the mulch maybe once a year, once every couple of years if it's like a, you know, a blended mulch. So you can either pull the mulch aside and then mix it in and then replace the mulch back around it, or you can wait until you replenish the mulch like once a year, I would say.
Awesome. Mona, I'm going to unmute you to ask your questions now.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to ask you to clarify something you said about the irrigation system. You said to avoid those thin little drip kind of lines, but if I do a conversion, yeah, those. But if I do a conversion from a regular sprinkler, you know, the old style heads, the conversion that you were mentioning, don't I need those little thin drip lines out at the edge near the plants?
So what we recommend is the inline drip system. So this tubing, if you can see, there's this little black spot, and there's another one down here. The emitters are actually molded right into the tubing, and those emitters also have check valves. So when the system turns on, it pressurizes water, and those open up and they distribute water. And then when the irrigation controller goes off, the pressure reduces and they close, and it keeps water in the lines all the time. That's what the check valve does. That check valve also keeps dirt and bugs out, which is why we can either mount it on the surface or below the surface, 3 to 4 inches below grade. I like the surface mount on these just because invariably me or the gardener digs a shovelful, you know, to plant a new plant, and we slice through the piping if we can't see it, and then we're repairing piping. So if you keep it on top of the mineral soil and then mulch over the top of it, that seems to be you don't see it, right? Because your mulch is over the top, but you can brush the mulch away and find where it's running. So that's kind of our recommendation for reducing maintenance. But this comes in, this is like 17 millimeter size, but there's also these inline drip tubing that come in a size that's this size too. I think Toro maybe makes it. Either way, the Retro 1800, the Rainbird product, has this threaded top, and there's different fittings. So this is your standard Retro 1800, and it comes with different fittings. So this is for the larger inline drip tubing, but they also have a fitting on top of it that's for the spaghetti tubing and smaller tubing. So you can retrofit and then use this fitting on top for any drip system.
Okay, if you don't mind, a quick follow-up on that brown tubing, those fittings where the water comes out in fixed locations, but what if my plants are in different locations and where the openings are needed?
Yeah, so good question. We cover this a lot in the irrigation special topic, but maybe we don't. We cover this a lot in our one-on-one coaching, so maybe we need to add that. So these come molded into the tubing at different intervals. So in this case, it's about a 12-inch interval. So that's how you order it from the manufacturer. And then it distributes along the whole line. So if I have like medium-sized shrubs, I would just loop this kind of alongside my shrubs. If I have a higher water use medium-sized shrub, I might have 2 lines, one on each side of the shrub. If I have like ground cover, really small, where I need, or higher water use, where I need a lot of water close together, then when I loop it around, I'm going to have it 12-inch emitter spacing, and then I'm going to run each line 12 inches apart. And so I have 12-inch on center spacing. That's where the next loop or the next row comes out. And that's how I get my even water distribution to a whole area, is I'm putting more lines through it. But otherwise, for bigger shrubs, you can just loop this where it is. If you have an area where you're taking out turf and one area is going to be planted and then another area is going to be rock and then plants again, you can always splice blank tubing in that spot that doesn't need to have the emitters going.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Okay, let's get through these last slides and then we can jump online real quick.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so we want to maintain the watering basins on young trees throughout the second year of establishment. We want to fertilize each April with kind of a root feeding, and like this is one that's recommended for your basic trees. If it's a heavy flowering or fruit producing tree, you'd want to research that or talk to a help desk like Walter Anderson's again. So that they like basic recommendations. This is the NPK 10-15-15 slow release fertilizer. And then irrigate is required to be within a water budget and maintain adequate growth and appearance. So at the residential level, you guys don't have to worry about water budgets. At the professional level, we have to sometimes worry about those because water costs can be very high. Shrub maintenance. So we want to thin and shape and head. So that's like cut the spent blooms off of our shrubs as only as needed, but at least annually. We want to try and maintain a natural branching habit and form. So if we have shrubs that we have researched that the mature size should fill the space, we want it to have that naturalistic form. A lot of the contractors just come in every week and they start shearing and shearing and shearing, and they create these boxes or round domes or these snake-like features. Generally, that they're just so used to doing that. That's their natural go-to. A lot of times you have to do that if you've planted a shrub that's too big for the space. And now it's almost a culture where people think that looks tight and neat. And I think some classical designs, like if you go to Europe, they do have very tight boxed hedges, like boxwoods. So that is a certain look. But a lot of our low water plant species don't really take that shearing very well. So it also creates a less healthy plant in that what happens is the plant stops having like a vase-like form and only has a glaze of leaves on these repeated cuts. So it weakens the plants and makes it more prone to pests and diseases and also drought impacts. So you want to maintain shrubs at driveways to ensure a safe vehicular access and view. So if you're pulling out of your driveway and you've replanted the parkway and the shrubs have gotten a bit big there, you want to keep those shrubs down so you can see pedestrians. Prune at the proper time of year for each species. And that promotes new growth and flowering. Some of our plants only flower every other year. India hawthorn, which is commonly used in our region, certainly in the 60s, 70s, even today, it only flowers every 2 years. So if your maintenance guy is coming out and shearing it every 2 weeks, you're never going to see flowers on that plant. And when we've done corrective pruning, it's glorious when it is maintained in its naturalistic form. It's covered in flowers and then they have these blue berries. But you rarely see that in our landscape anymore because the branches need 2 years to flower. Irrigate is required to maintain adequate growth and appearance. For ground cover, we need to pull out any weeds and do them early before they become a threat to overtaking our ground cover. And a healthy ground cover is the best defense against weeds. Usually ground covers require a little bit more fertilization, so you might have to do those, more often. You could do a slow release pellet fertilizer, which would last longer. but if you're doing a basic fertilizer, you might have to do it every few months. So we want to trim the edges as necessary to keep from encroaching on sidewalks, sprinkler heads, and adjacent areas. Spot check our moisture and make sure that, you know, our watering root depth zone is where we need it. That's, you know, at least 6-8 inches deep. We want to adjust for our 3 seasonal schedules. We talked about that. Check for leaks and fix leaks promptly on our irrigation maintenance. If you have drip systems, we want to check the filters and flush them out to reduce clogging the emitters and the heads. If we have a lot of sediment or anything else that's gotten in the system, you can undo the clip at the end or undo the last distribution point and let water flush through the system, which will take out any sediment. For spray heads, you want to adjust to prevent overspray on hardscape. So sometimes the heads get bumped and they start to rotate, and now it's watering your sidewalk instead of actually your plant, so it can rotate those nozzles back in place. So you know, the valves can be adjusted. Some of them have little pressure regulators on there, so we make sure that we're adjusting for any excessive pressure in the system. Again, in our irrigation section, we talk a lot about proper irrigation pressure. So if you haven't taken that and you have questions about that, I recommend that topic. Sometimes when our power goes out, our smart control doesn't have a battery backup, and it wipes our whole program and it goes back to a default of 10 minutes a day. So if you've just converted your system to drip irrigation, which requires maybe in peak season, maybe that requires 45 minutes a day, and your clock has just defaulted to 10 minutes a day, you're probably going to lose your plants. And I've seen that happen on some of my projects. So make sure if you don't have a battery backup or some kind of backup in the controller, that if you have a power outage, you go out and reset your schedule in there. And then check your agency. Some agencies have restrictions for irrigation days, and that really comes into play when we go into drought. That you might only be able to water, you know, on certain days of the week if you're an even number address versus an odd number address. Know if you've retrofitted your system to like drip irrigation that requires a 45-minute, you know, run time, and we go into water restrictions, you don't have to adjust that system down to 10 minutes a week. You've already done your part by creating an efficient system. So if you read the fine print, if you have the low precipitation nozzles or the drip irrigation retrofit, you can continue to run the system longer so that your plants get watered. You may not be able to water every day. You probably still have to respect the days of the week. Some good tools to have on hand for maintenance are a small flathead screwdriver, an adjustment tool. This is where you clip it right onto the nozzle and you can adjust the arc of it, and small channel locks. Sometimes the heads actually get where the pop-up gets twisted, so you can very carefully kind of twist them back with the channel locks, but not too hard because you can break your head. For overhead sprinklers, you're going to look for broken or leaning sprinkler heads, overspray, misting instead of spraying, uneven coverage, spray patterns blocked by plant material. So you might have to raise the head if that's the condition, or cut back the plant material. Any broken or clogged nozzles, sometimes sediment can get in the nozzle, so you can take them off. There's a little filter in the nozzle, or you could run the system and flush it out just like the drip system. That can happen with some of those button drip emitters too. Oh, sorry. Subsurface, you can look for cues of a break by seeing excessively wet areas, unusual mounding in turf areas, or water flowing or seeping from the turf edges. So drip irrigation, you're going to want to inspect some of these joints to make sure that they're still intact. I don't see this as much of a problem with the bigger tubing as the little spaghetti tubing. Those joints are always popping off all the time. So replace any missing or broken drip emitters. Also, they should be up on little stakes because we talked about they don't have a check valve, so they can get clogged really easily. Here's what a clogged filter in the nozzle looks like. So to clear a clogged system, you're going to turn the system off, remove the nozzle from the sprinklers at the end of the line, or end caps from drip, run the system a few minutes until a clean stream of water flows, and then turn the system off. You can check each nozzle filter and flush them if you have a really bad sediment problem. And then any of the filters if you have a drip system, so either in the Retro 1800 kit or if you have a drip assembly, it has a filter in there, like a valve assembly. Reassemble the system, run and check for proper operation. Okay, so that we can kind of take a look at this is the SoCal Water Smart. This is where you would go for your rebates, and we talked about that briefly. There's a bunch of different rebates. And then here is that slide with the watersmart.org, the new website. If you pull down landscape classes, you'll see this landscape resources, and you click on that, and I'll go on there after this and show you. But just for those of you who have to get off right at 12, that's where you would go to download the PDF version of the guide. And so the Sustainable Landscape Guide is in there too. That focuses a lot on stormwater. This is where you would register for the workshops like you did today. You could register for the 4-class series. Right now they have a little glitch in the application. So it is grabbing the information on their side, but it seems to be getting hung up with the email addresses, and their security system is blocking everybody's email addresses is what the problem is. So they are grabbing your information even though you don't get a confirmation email, but you're welcome to explore that and apply for that. There is eligibility for this program, but you do get some more one-on-one help through the design process. And time with an hour with a landscape designer to talk about your property. So that, we create the base sheet for you. And then here's where those videos on demand are. So that if you get on this page, that's what you'll see. And I'm going to jump on that really quick. So I've got to stop sharing my screen and then click the new share screen. Share. Oh, that's not it. That's the same. Stop sharing. Okay, let me open it up. I guess because it was minimized. It didn't want to do that. Share screen.
Michelle, while you're pulling that up, I will just take a moment. I know it is 12, so for folks that do have to leave, I just want to say thank you, everyone, for participating today, and remind you that there will be the recording on our greenoceanside.org website, and you can see previous workshops up there as well. We will also be sending out a survey right after this workshop this morning. So if you could please fill that out, your feedback is very valuable to us. So thank you everyone, and we will stay on and answer some of the other questions that had come in. But if you have to go, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Yes, likewise. Again, thanks for your time, everyone. So I'm on that address that I gave you. And here's where you would go to the resources, would be on this link here. Take me there. So here's where that homeowner's guide to a water smart landscape, and that is what started this education program. Here's the sustainable landscapes guide that deals a lot with stormwater. So if you're interested in stormwater swales and how to calculate how much you need, or rain barrels, understanding how impermeable surfaces and how much water they generate, that's a great resource. It also has a lot of resources within that guide too. Links you back to the on-demand videos, gives you some of the local gardens, some of the mulch places, firescaping type of information, different garden magazines, the different associations we talked about, APLD, ASLA, California Landscape Contractors Irrigation Association. Here is, they have some lists for the high efficiency nozzle, which come in handy. This is if you want to find your ETO, that's also handy. Watering calculator, so a lot of water management type features there. They have some templates for design on here. I think I want to show you. A lot of plant information, so those are good to explore. Oh, in our homeowner's guide, we have plant palettes. So if you're struggling with plant choices, let me see. Go all the way down to the very end. We found this was a big hang up with our participants of just overwhelming number of choices to select plants. So we've created some palettes. So we have kind of an Asian effect and contemporary effect and Mediterranean and garden friendly, native, but ones that hold their green color a little bit better. Tropical effect, so at least can get you started if you have kind of a theme. So those are right in that manual of the homeowner's guide. So I wanted to point those plant palettes out there for you. Incentives, I think it's got some links to the turf rebate. Do we want to answer questions and then I can jump on the irrigation scheduling site?
Sounds good. Let's see. So we have a question from somebody who has termites in some of his tree branches, and they want to see how they could save the tree.
Yeah, so termites are going after dead wood. And so sometimes the tree's just at its natural end of lifespan. So I would probably start by figuring out what species of tree is and then do some basic plant research to Google what's the expected lifespan. I think there's a Cal Poly Select a Tree site that I think lists their expected lifespan. So if you see that it's, you know, a 40-year lifespan and it's 40 years old and it's got termites, it just means that it's going into decline and it's naturally dying and it's got dead wood in it, which is what the termites are going after. If it's a tree that shouldn't have dead wood, you need to figure out what is causing it to have dead wood. So does it have another pest that's killing the tree? Something's going on to create those dead woody patches. And that's what's, once you correct, you can remove the dead woody branches. It could be as simple as sometimes people cut their water and then the tree goes into decline and is dying because it maybe was in a lawn that was used to getting watered like every day for short, shallow bursts. And then you cut the water because you want to do a lawn conversion. But the tree is used to having that water, which hasn't been replaced, so it goes into decline and starts to die back really quickly. And the solution then is just to cut the woody branches off, and, you know, have an arborist come out and do that carefully and get the water going again. And then once the tree starts, you know, not being in stress and dying back, then you won't have the problem with drawing the termites in. They're only going to go after dead material.
Great, okay. And then the next question is, what is the best fertilizer for plumeria trees?
So plumerias are like any of your flowering fertilizers. So I would go, you know, to your big box store or nursery and just look for a fertilizer that supports flowering growth. I always like to use a slow release fertilizer because sometimes you can put so much fertilizer down you can burn the plant. So when you use a slow release, it's going to fertilize slower for a longer period of time, so you don't have to do it as often. So I like Osmocote. That's my big box store brand of choice. I have some others that are just sold at professional warehouses. Grow Power is another one. I really like their products. They're more organic in nature, but you can only buy them at a professional landscape supply, like some of those irrigation supply houses we talked about would carry it.
Great. And next is, what time of year is the proper time to prune bushes?
I always like to prune them in either fall or winter. And that's because they kind of shut down with the colder weather. And that just seems like when they can adjust and not end up where they're, in spring when they're actively growing, they have a lot of sap going just like a tree would through its system. So if you cut it then, you have a lot more wounding and they lose a lot more of their lose more blood if you do it in spring. So you kind of want to do it when they're starting to shut down.
Okay, and I think we have one more. So this person is trying to design their landscape themselves on a budget. They're asking if you would suggest the first step to be checking out the APLD and American Society of Landscape Architects website, or sort of where that starting point would be for him.
Yeah, I think your starting point is to watch some of our videos and really think about how you want to use your spaces. Because, we live in this incredible climate. So it's almost like if you've always wanted an extra living room somewhere in addition to your house, you can create an outdoor room that you can use probably 325 days of the year. So, think about how you're going to use the space you want to renovate. And I think the videos do a really nice job, or the design session special topic does a really nice job of walking you through how to rethink your space. And then reach out to the professionals, because then you are driving the discussion of how you see yourself using that space. So you're gonna help them a lot to get to the right design that's gonna function well for your family.
Thanks. Okay, there's actually a couple more that came in. So, do you have a recommendation of ways to clean the minerals at the bottom of potted plants?
Yeah, again, that's due to the alkaline water that we import from the Colorado River, and it's alkaline here too. That's indicative of an arid climate. So what that mineral is a salt buildup. So it's telling me there's a mineral salt buildup in the plant, and for proper plant health, you could have put a little bit of gypsum down at the top and try and work that in the soil and start leaching that through. If you're talking about actually the white crust on the pot, you would have to almost like use a cleaner on the pot like you would use for hard water stains inside your house, right? But if it's on the soil, we can get rid of it by leaching, putting a little bit of gypsum in and then flushing the salt out of it.
Okay, and then this person's asking if you're familiar with Eleanor's VF2 liquid weekly vitamins. She's wondering if she can apply that each week through the drip system.
I know there's a lot of good liquid applications. I'm not familiar with that one. Generally, when we add that to the drip irrigation system, we do that with a small fertigator. So it's actually an assembly where you would add your concentration, and it would send it into the water, for a certain dosing during a time frame. So there's not really a way to that's the only way I know of to get it in the drip system, is to go through what's called a fertigator.
All right, that is all of our questions.
So we'll jump on this watering calculator real quick. You can see, since we're in a hot spell, we're at 100%. So we're at our maximum plant use time, and it's been hot all week. So you can see it rotating through, like it's been hot all in the day, it's been hot all week, and we all know that. And now this month is also hot. So we're really in that summer season. So if we wanted to create a watering calculator at our house, we could start here. So we're going to answer the questions below. So we're going to say this is my, I'm going to say shrub, front shrub. Oh. Put my house address in because I need to do this anyway. Type of watering system. So I actually have drip on mine, and I have about a 1 gallon per minute. I'm going to adjust this. I'm going to say, it doesn't let me. I'm going to get, here's where I put the application rate. So I'm going to pay 0.6 gallon per hour. Okay. Oh, gosh. Hey, oh yeah, it's got that. And then I'm going to add another area. So now I'm going to say I have a sprinkler. Oh, sorry, I missed a few of these. Back. Let me try this again. I apologize. It's been a while since I've done this. There's a plant. I'm going to say the low water use plant, and I have a clay loam in my neighborhood. I'm going to say drip. I'm going to say my application is 0.6, and then I'm going to add another area. So I'm going to say this front. I'm going to say this is a cool season grass. Got clay loam. It's going to be a sprinkler. And then I'm going to say it's like one. I'm going to give myself say I've looked it up on the catalog of the manufacturer. And this would be like a conventional overhead spray. I'm saying it's 1.86 because I've looked it up. And then I'm going to hit my watering schedule. And now it's given me the 2 zones. So for my front shrubs, which is drip, it's saying my maximum start time is 16 minutes a day. And you can see that when I get to June and July and August, I have to run it 8 times per week. So I'd have to run it every day, and on one day, I'd have to run it twice. That means that my clay loam is so slow, I have to do that split cycling. So if I decided to run it only 3 days a week, I'd have to do multiple split cycling to get the water I need to that plant zone. In this case, if I chose to run it 7 days per week, on one day, I would have to do 16 minutes, let it rest for about an hour, and then do another 16 minutes to get this total runtime, which is what that plant probably needs to be healthy. So for my front turf, my maximum runtime, because I have clay soil, is 7 minutes. So you can see how much water that I need. All right, I've got my precipitation rate. I'm going to run it 7 minutes. And on this case, I'm actually able to, I don't have to do split cycling unless we went into a drought and I'm only allowed to water 3 days a week and I really need to do 6 days a week. I would have to do split cycling. If I had to bring it back to 3 days a week, I would have to do split cycling on those 3 days to get to my 6 watering cycles. So I would run it for 7 minutes, let it turn it off for about an hour, and then I could run it another 7 minutes. And you see that happen like I live in an area that's got clay soil, so that's what you see with clay soil. If I had sandy soil, that wouldn't be a problem. I would have much longer run times. I'll go down and do it again with, I'm going to change this to sand. What's the sand? Maybe I'm by the beach. The watering schedule. So I just did the front turf, I guess, but maximum minutes per start time. That's strange. Cool season grass. Seems like it should have gone the other way. Check that. That's a sand. Right. I got my just give me a. I'm going to go to the default. I'm worried that's the drip amount. Gallons a minute. I'm going to do 1 gallon. That looks a little bit better. So it was defaulting over to the input I had seems just to relate to drip. So for spray heads, they're giving you some basic choices. And this is what I would expect to see with a sandy soil is I need to run that sprinkler longer, almost twice as long if I have sandy soil. And I have a bunch of start times, right, in summer because it's a high water use. I've got the cool season grass. I've got a different kind of rotor, but whatever, here nor there. I have to have a bunch of doubled up split cycle to get to this 132 minutes because I only have 7 days in the week. So that means I have to run it multiple times on a day to get the proper amount of water to that plant. So that's going to be your easiest way to get a water schedule together. Weird. I got to look at this a little bit more and figure out why. It would seem like with sandy soil, it's draining fast, but it's certainly not moving laterally. So I would expect a longer run time. I'm going to figure that out a little bit. I might have to pull Joni into that. But a good starting point for you guys, because water, setting your water schedule, at least you get that start point, and then you can run it and then adjust it from there. And then you'll have to refine it and tune it up a little bit. But a great resource for you guys. Any other questions before we go today?
Thanks for walking through that, Michelle.
Yeah. Great.
I don't see any other coming in. So I think we will stop there. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Okay. All right. Have a
great.
good weekend, everyone.
Everybody.
All right. Bye. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.